হ্যালো হ্যালো অতনু শুনতে পাচ্ছ?
Okay. Shall we start, sir?
Ujjal babu aছেন, Dept babu, Dept babu, অতনু বাবু।
Good afternoon, everyone. In the beginning, let me offer the greetings to all of you. Before we begin this webinar, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to all our esteemed guests for accepting our invitation and coming over here for this webinar. I convey my best regards to all of you, sir, for providing us the opportunity to be acquainted with you and enlightened with the thoughts you would share. We have with us Honorable Resource Person, Dr. Ujjal Kumar Panda, Assistant Professor in the WBES and Head, Department of English, Government General Degree College, Daton 2, Paschim Medinipur. Honorable Chairperson Dr. Devdas Roy, and respected distinguished speakers, Mr. Otonu Vera, Mr. Somadip Chakraborty, and Mr. Somen Jana. The schedule of the webinar will focus on the topic, rereading British Romantic literature in the 21st century. It will include more issues to address the full aspects of the topic. The topic of the discussion and debate for today's webinar we have chosen specially keeping in mind the interest of our students. And finally, I must name him who will speak when I finish, Professor Uttam Kumar Maji, without whose endeavors and dedicated efforts it would not have been possible to organize this webinar. I must say the whole credit goes to him. He single-handedly arranged everything, be it preparation of brochure or advertisement and contacting the delegates. He did everything. A special thanks once again, Uttam sir. Now Uttam sir will continue. Sir, please.
Thank you, sir. So, before entering into the main program, I would give my heartfelt gratitude to Mr. Otonu Vera and Somadipda, who are my seniors, and Ujjal Babu, Devdas Babu, and Somenda also. Okay, they are my elder brothers, like. And today's topic is rereading British Romantic literature in the 21st century. Okay, so the concept note about that topic, Romanticism, according to Walter Pater, is the addition of strangeness to beauty. So it is the renaissance of wonder. Today, the so-called great romantics are mainly confined in school, colleges, and university curricula. And we read their works in relation to some well-known stereotypes like the love of nature, a consciousness of beauty, a kind of aesthetic resistance to rationalism, love for medievalism and supernaturalism, etc. Romanticism and romantic designate not only a historical period, but also a fundamental and recurring attitude towards intellectual literature and life, in which emotional and intellectual freedom of the individual is elevated over the traditional norms and strictures of the society. The Romantic movement developed as a reaction against the narrow rationalism of the early and mid-18th century, against the Gothic novel in England, and French Revolution played a historical role in Romantic movement, particularly for its emphasis on liberty and equality. The central focus, as we know, of Romanticism was the belief in nature as a source of poetic inspiration and the poet's creative imagination and the underlying spirit of nature produce an intense subjective experience. But if we consider the 19th century as a crossroad of modernization and the ensuing imperialist powers that drastically changed the way of looking at national as well as international politics and economy, romantic stereotypes become fraught with multi-layered connotations. At the same time, it opens up the possibility of looking at the great bulk of romantic literature from various theoretical viewpoints. So, in the age of globalization, we need to rediscover British Romantic literature because perhaps it is the earliest available instance of social criticism of the hidden perils of a capitalist, hegemonic, and dominant world order that modernization and globalization produce. So, on that eve, uh, I would like to invite our research person, Dr. Ujjal Kumar Panda, to share his thoughts on rethinking romantic literature in the age of globalization. Dr. Ujjal Kumar Panda is an assistant professor in the West Bengal Educational Service and head in the Department of English at Government General Degree College, Daton, Paschim Midnapur. He did his PhD on the works of Seema Seni and Philip Larkin from Vidyasagar University in 2017 and widely published in many national and international journals and books. Some of his important publications include a chapter entitled Tropical Disease and Helpless Colonial Responses, Medical Humanism in Green's Journey Without Maps, and Ferrell's The Siege of Krishnapur, published in Imperial Maladies, Literature on Healthcare and Psychoanalysis in India, 2017, by Nova Science and Publishers, New York, USA, and there are many more. So on this tip, I would request Dr. Ujjal Kumar Panda to share his thought and thank you.
Thank you, Uttam. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Before beginning with starting with my lecture or my talk on rethinking romantic literature in the age of globalization, I take the opportunity to thank the organizers of this webinar, particularly Professor Uttam Maji, who was actually instrumental in making this webinar possible, I think. At the same time, I want to thank the organizers, particularly the principal chair of the college, for making the webinar a reality, as well as all the teachers of the Department of English of this college, the head of the department of this college. I thank them all because romantic literature, which is actually a very important part of our English literature syllabi in the college level, even in the school level also. In the university level, we frequently go through the works of the great romantics like William Wordsworth or Samuel Taylor Coleridge, or the second generation romantic poets like that of John Keats or P.B. Shelley or Byron. We are acquainted with their works, and whenever we read their works, we follow some well-known parameters of judging their works or reading their works. When we critically read their works, we actually become subjected to some well-known stereotypes. For example, we deal with their love for beauty, we deal with their consciousness of nature, or a kind of pasha for the hoary days of antiquity, medieval world, or that of the supernatural or Gothic occurrence, particularly in the distant places in the Orient. So all these are some parameters which we follow when we try to teach our students in our classes. But if we actually rethink the advent of Romantic literature in the first half of the 19th century, or it began in the last half of the 18th century, as we know, with the hands in the hands of the so-called pre-romantic poets or the precursors of Romanticism. If we judge the texts with the contextual details, we find that Romantic literature was much more than these stereotypical discussions, because a note of protest, a note of resistance to what was happening in the contemporary Europe, not only in the contemporary Europe, but in the contemporary world in general, is very much present in the texts, though not in a very overt way always, but there is a kind of undercurrents of protest literature or resistance literature in the works of the great romantics, the poets, the essayists, even the romantic novelists. If we actually change our viewpoint and we actually try to reread romantic literature from that point of view, it becomes a matter of surprise that romantic literature actually kickstarted the way we think the world in the age of capitalism, in the age of the so-called modernization of the world and the ensuing global processes. But before we actually go through those complex issues and how literature is somewhat related to those issues, let us have a kind of understanding of the term romantic in general. Because if we do not understand or do not try to understand the etymology of the term romantic, it will be difficult to us to locate the points of resistance or protest that were hidden under the garb of the so-called love for nature or consciousness of beauty or Hellenism or love for medievalism, supernaturalism, etc. The word romantic, as we know, it is very difficult to delimit because there are so many different attempts to define romanticism in the history of literature and art that it has become, to quote Shelley, one word too often profaned. But if we seek to know the etymology of the word romanticism or romantic, then we find that the word romantic actually derives from the old French word romance, R-O-M-A-N-Z, meaning the vernacular Romance language that developed from Latin or Italian, from French, from Spanish, from Portuguese, Catalan, and Provencal. In the medieval time, romance or romaunt, as we know, came to mean the tale of chivalry written in one of these languages, normally in verse, and often taking the form of a quest. From that point of view, our colloquial use of the term romance and romantic to describe intense emotional experiences can be traced back to this medieval sense of the word, that is, a tale of quest, a tale of chivalry. But the word romantic came into common usage in English particularly in the sphere of English literature, in the 18th century, by which time the connotation of the medieval romance had expanded to encompass a wide-ranging taste for the picturesque and the fanciful. It was often described as the cult of sensibility or sentiment, although in a very derogatory sense, because as we know, the 18th century was a time dominated by rationalism, or it was famously known as an age of prose and reason. Okay. Now, the cult of sensibility or sentiment of the mid-18th century, it actually played a very important role in the description of romantic, the term romantic, or the description of the term romanticism in a negative sense. For example, the classically minded Samuel Johnson, he was very skeptical of the new tendency and defined romantic in his famous dictionary, which was published, as we know, in 1755, in the following manner. I'm quoting, "Romantic had in fact been used since the Renaissance to suggest free expression of the imagination in the arts, but mainly in a negative sense. Romantic imaginings were thought to interfere with the clarity of the art form, and so lay beyond the bounds of proper subject matter. The emerging romantic spirit of the 18th century England was seen by some as a revival of Elizabethan literature and its Gothic tendencies. English Romanticism had been described as a renaissance of the Renaissance, because it tried to revive, according to the 18th century rationalist thinkers, it tried to revive the cult of sensibility that was in vogue in the time of Renaissance, or more precisely in the Elizabethan literature. Okay, so it was described by them as a kind of renaissance of the Renaissance. But thanks to the influence of the late 18th century German cultural theorists, Romanticism was adopted across Europe and the New World as a convenient description for distinctively contemporary modes of thought, losing in the process many of its negative connotations. Johnson's idea of Romanticism, from that point of view, which is clearly derogatory, is unquestionably related to his belief in the 18th century rationalism. Later, instead of improbable notions and false sensibility, Romanticism came to stand for authenticity, integrity, and spontaneity. It was seen as a positive artistic and intellectual assertion of the extremes in the human psyche, the areas of experience beyond logic and reason, which could only be expressed in a direct and intimate way. These new concerns were seen as a valid response to the extremes of changes and uncertainties which the age itself displayed. Now, I'm coming to the causes behind the changes and uncertainties that the period, particularly the late 18th century and the early 19th century, displayed in the socio-cultural domain of British life, not only British life. in the European life in general. In 1798, the German critic and philosopher Friedrich von Schlegel used the term Romanticist to describe contemporary forms of artistic expression, relating it particularly to what he called, I quote, very important term, progressive universal poetry. Now the term progressive is very important here. So why? If we attempt to seek the contemporary relevance of the literary movement that took place some 200 years back in this age of globalization, the term progressive becomes very important. The two generations of Romantic writers were progressive, to use Schlegel's term, in their professedly anti-establishment stance, and it becomes a matter of serious discourse if we judge their works in relation to their time, which particularly situated the beginning of modernization and globalization in the real sense of the terms. Actually, Romanticism was taking root at a time when Britain was gradually yet steadily propelled into an industrialized capitalism. The consequences of this technological destruction of the landscape, particularly through the process of enclosure. The enclosure is a very important concept if we try to examine Romantic literature in general, because this process of enclosure caused destruction of the rural landscape, and it was the beginning of the crossroad, because 19th century, as we know, it was a time of change. It was a crossroad in the real sense of the term, because it situated the change, the shift from a kind of rural agrarian economy to a kind of urban industrial economy. Not only that, it was the end of the old world charm and the beginning of the cult of modernization. Through imperialist power, through colonization, and the end result was the so-called globalization. Okay, now this enclosure resulted in famine in the rural areas, conflict and alienation of the peasants. In Wordsworth's early poetry, there are many references to the increasing numbers of the marginal wanderers who were displaced from their communities by these conditions. Actually, it was environment that was under considerable threat from Enlightenment ideology in the 18th century. The force of industrial and economic change granting little respect to the countryside or its rural inhabitants. The compulsion of getting and spending, as Wordsworth wrote in his sonnet, "The World is Too Much With Us," published in 1807, had infected British society with greed and unrealizable desire, creating a society of individuals now out of tune with nature. The shift into this culture of greed, as Wordsworth puts it, was set in motion by the newly embraced capitalist mode of production, which actually flourished under a rhetoric of quote-unquote improvement. This so-called improvement referred to both the tending of land to make it more profitable and as well as to the people who labors to manage the land. While the idea of cultivating people was offensive to Wordsworth, he was appalled by the idea that nature could be improved upon. Okay, now what is this idea of improvement in the early 19th century? Actually, improvement meant recasting the countryside in accordance with the aesthetic convention of the picturesque, one that deliberately reproduced the rusticity of the landscape in an artificial or virtual manner. Now, recasting the countryside in an artificial and virtual manner, as we know, is the key word of urban planning. Therefore, we can easily understand that urbanization was taking place at the cost of destruction of the countryside and rural agrarian economy. Now, the propertied elite who populated London-based courts, offices of state and parliament, for example, brought up land previously owned by local community and then landscaped it into private parks for their personal enjoyment. Privatized land thus served as a kind of refuge for the rich from the self-absorbed reality of metropolitan life, but also made money as land that could be farmed and worked on. Accordingly, there were many landscapers at that time, like Richard Penn Knight or Lancelot Brown, who was actually given the name capability, and Humphrey Repton recreated a bucolic naturalism enhanced by simulated ruins, but with the vagrants and rural dwellers who had previously lived there airbrushed out. Okay, so 19th century, it was actually a time of cruel land acquisition, and it actually destroyed the known face of the country, which was a rural agrarian economy. Because, as I have already told, it was a time of change. The economy was changing, the worldview was changing, and it was changing at the cost of land acquisition, at the cost of the destruction of the peasant life, and at the cost of homelessness of a number of people who lived in village and who actually lived on cultivation and agricultural activity. Okay. Now, when we read many poems of William Wordsworth, we find that he always tries to depict the urban industrial society in negative light. And whenever he is describing the rural people, a poor person like poor Susan or Michael, he is actually full of praise for the kind of life they live. Now, if we go through his famous epic poem, especially the first book of the Prelude, we find that he is actually expressing his sense of disgust for the modern industrial city of the West, where he was choked, he was asphyxiated, And when he actually came back to the villages, to his known rural landscape, he is finding it as a kind of refreshment. So what is the cause of this dichotomy? Actually, Wordsworth was progressive in the sense he was actually progressive from a different point of view, because all the great romantics, they were influenced by the democratic revolutions in France, uh, in the US, which actually took place towards the end of the 18th century. And to them, domination is something which is against progress. But to the government, which was keen on expanding their hold on the third world, in the countries in Asia, or in the countries in Africa, or in the countries in the Americas, or two Americas, they actually tried to ramp up production so that they can do business and they can actually establish their hold on the colonized nations. As a result, their idea of progress was industrialization. Their idea of progress was actually based upon urbanization. But to the democratic thinkers like Wordsworth or Keats, it was something which is actually a form of hegemony, which was actually a form of domination, or a kind of a violation of human rights. And when they are actually praising the common people, their lives, their simplicity, they are describing the beauty of British countryside. This particular attitude to nature, it is actually never free from their political thoughts or their political prejudices. And all these things try to change our general attitude towards reading romantic literature in general. Okay, now the Romantic period was a turbulent time in the history of Europe. Why? The governmental idea of progress, the idea of enclosure, industrialization that was necessary to ramp up production for the country's newly found aspiration of becoming a global imperial power, collided with the idea of progress of the liberal republicans at the universities, like the first generation romantic poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge, who were greatly influenced by the ideals of the French Revolution. The French Revolution, with all its anti-establishment connotations, made these thinkers to think progress in terms of a democratic attitude where domination of any kind is against the real progress of the society. Okay. Sometimes the protest against this domination is professed, as we find it in the poems of P.B. Shelley or Lord Byron, and sometimes it is more reserved, as it is there in the works of Wordsworth or Coleridge or Keats. If we look properly, marginal characters receive centrality in many of Wordsworth's poems, as we meet Michael or poor Susan or Lucy. In Keats's poems, we find a constant attempt to canonize the insignificant objects of nature, like a nightingale, the gnats, whom we find in Ode to Autumn, the hedge crickets, or a gourd. There is a continuous effort in his works to give a neglected season like autumn poetic grandeur, or to provide importance to an unworshipped goddess like Psyche, her due honor. Okay. Again, when Coldis is eulogizing the stately pleasure dome of Kubla Khan, an Oriental king, is not he attempting to ward off the contemporary Orientalist prejudices to see Oriental people and Oriental knowledge in negative light? These are very pertinent questions which actually come to our mind when we actually examine the romantic texts, the well-known romantic texts, in relation to the time which produced them. Okay. Actually, in the years between 1790 and 1830, over 150 million people were brought under British imperial control. Now, this was not only the beginning of urbanization and industrialization. The time was also the starting point of imperialism. Very importantly, during those same years, one of the most momentous outbursts of British literary and artistic production took place in Romanticism, announcing the arrival of a whole new age, a new world of social and individual traumas and possibilities. Interestingly, poverty and social unrest, which worsened in the late 18th century, largely because of Enclosure, became an international phenomenon because of imperialism, which was mainly based upon the forced seizure of land. Because if in England there was an attempt to make enclosures or to seize lands from the poor peasants, there were many peasant revolutions or rebellions during the time. If we actually go through history, we come to know about that. Interestingly, the practice of enclosure, which was internal, became international with the exercise of colonization, with the exercise of imperialism. Because if we think from that point of view, it becomes very clear to us that imperialism was also a kind of forceful seizure of land, okay, from the natives. Again, the expansion of the British Empire had been entirely sustained by black slaves and transatlantic slave trade, which not only caused cruel dispersion of the marginal natives, but also the Romantics. For the Romantics, it became a new consciousness of hegemonic domination. Now, I have referred to all these points because these contextual details are necessary to read Romantic literature from a different point of view. Okay. If we reread British Romantic poetry in relation to these contextual details, it no more remains a bulk of writing based upon a consciousness of beauty or a love for nature or a love for medieval world or Gothic supernaturalism. It becomes a form of protest literature or a kind of resistance literature. Okay. Therefore, To understand modern imperialism and modern capitalism as more than merely socio-economic practices or as a kind of cultural process, it requires for us to locate those practices on the literary historical map, precisely where we customarily found Romanticism. What I want to propose is that the dynamics between these discourses and practices constituted an overall cultural revolution called modernization, which was perhaps most adequately grasped at the multiple horizons where the economic and literary, the poetic and the imperial, the social and the philosophical converge. Actually, modern capitalism and modern imperialism and modernization itself must ultimately be understood as global processes and not, for all their Eurocentrism, as specifically British or European phenomena. From that point of view, what was happening in India or Africa or the Arab world should also enable us to understand fully what was the events, what were the events in Romantic Britain. In this way, when all is said and done, Romanticism will turn out to be not only worldly but also global, marking the beginning of a process that has only in recent years came to be recognized as globalization. This will also enable us to examine the Romantic texts from newer viewpoints. Let us now read two very well-known texts from two different perspectives. That is, considering Wordsworth's Tintanabe as topopoetics and William Hazlitt's The Indian Juggler, the famous essay, The Indian Juggler, in relation to the curious case of Ramaswamy, the South Indian street performer who became a sensation in the 19th century England. Now, in British Romantic poetry, these so-called topopoetics are found in plenty. A very familiar example may be William Wordsworth's much anthologized Tintanabe, which, as we know, has got a very long title, that is lines composed a few miles above Tintanabe, on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour. Now, interestingly, there is no reference to either Tintanabe or River Wye in the main body of the poem, except in the title, but the description of steep and lofty cliffs, hedgerows, pastoral farms, and plots of cottage ground attempts to conjure up the specific geographical characteristic of the Wye River Valley, even to those who have never gone there. Okay. Again, the poem is structured like a memory, as we know. The poet contemplates the same place that he visited some 5 years back and recollects in the tranquility of the present how these beauteous forms have continued to haunt him with an assertion of solace and mental peace in the in-between years when the weary weight of this unintelligible world tended to suffocate him. He also says in detail how his understanding and experience of the world has undergone a profound change with age and maturity, and this change refers to the intimate imaginative association between human beings and places in general. When Wordsworth writes, "For I have learned," I am quoting from the poem, "to look on nature not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still sad music of humanity, not harsh, not nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue, we readily discover a kind of phenomenological understanding of the nature of place experience, where place is no more a topography, but a kind of landscape of the mind. The landscape of the mind, which is under scanner, which is actually undergoing the pressure of hegemonic domination, which is actually turning into an urban industrial society. Okay. And the pain of that change is very much visible when we actually come across his own idea of nature, his own idea of beauty, his own idea of spirituality that is hidden in the lap of nature. Okay. Now, literature from this point of view has a potent capacity to evoke a particular place, to give it a specific meaning, and to make us grounded to it, even when we are not familiar with it. If we do not know the contextual details, it actually makes us conscious of the pain, of the suffering that the poet is undergoing due to the socio-economic change that is taking place during that time, and he is against it. He is actually not approving the change. Okay, we become conscious of that pain, that suffering from the very attitude towards landscape or topography that he is actually trying to present before us. Okay. Now, Tim Creswell, a very famous critic related to the sphere of geocriticism and humanistic geography, he actually popularized the term topopoetics in his famous essay, Towards Topopoetics, Space, Place, and the Poem, that was published in 2017. And he actually used the term to denote the essential interdependence between poetry and place. He writes, I'm quoting from the essay, "An engagement with the philosophical basis of topos adds to our original definition of place as a gathering of things, practices, and meanings in a particular location. While place is all of these things, this definition fails to underline the basic significance of being placed to being in the world. A topopoetic account is one which recognizes the specificity of the nearness of the things in place and at the same time focuses our attention on the way in which the poem is itself a form of building and dwelling. Poems of place are not simply poems about place." Very important line. Poems of place. But Tinton Abbey is a poem of place. If Tinton Abbey is about a place, it is about a place called Tinton Abbey, or it is about a place that is somewhere in the Wye River Valley in the countryside of England towards the beginning, towards the end of the 18th century. Okay. Now, poems of place are not simply poems about place. Rather, they are species of place with a special relationship to what it is to be in external place. Included in this is a recognition that poems as places have a material existence as a gathering of words on the page which takes a particular spatial form. Topopoetic means closing the gap between material form of the poem and the early world of place. It means attending to the presence of place within the poem. Now, what kind of place? A place which is steadily changing, and the poet is eulogizing the beauty of the place because he believes in the place. He does not want the mechanical change of the rural countryside. That is why he was choked in the great city of London, and he is full of freshness in the Wye River Valley. Okay. Now, as I have already told, that this was the time which was actually the starting point of British imperialism. Okay. And all the internal changes, the modernization, process of modernization, it was actually integrally related to the process of impending aspiration for colonizing a large portion of the world in the name of enlightenment, in the name of quote unquote improvement. Now, very interestingly, they were doing the so-called improvement in their own country at the cost of displacement of millions of poor peasants or farmers. And they were continuing their imperial domination again in the name of improvement, displacing millions of blacks in the name of slave trade, millions of Indians in the name of indentured laboring. Okay. Now, here comes the point which I was actually referring to in course of my talk. The curious case of Ramaswamy, the South Indian juggler in the 19th century. Now, there is a very good essay entitled The Mysterious Alien Indian Street Jugglers in Victorian London. And it was published in EPW, or Economic and Political Weekly, on April 2, 2011. The essay was written by Sumanto Banerjee. It's a very well researched work. There we come across the famous Indian juggler Ramaswamy. Perhaps his name was Ramaswamy, but he was referred to as Ramaswamy in England. And he became a sensation during a time. Okay, although his life ended in the most deplorable condition possible. Okay. Now, in that particular essay, Sumanto Banerjee is writing, even before Queen Victoria, I am quoting from the essay, ascended the throne in London in 1837 and gave her name to the period that was to mark an era in British history, Indians had started arriving in England. From the early 18th century, as Lascars who crewed the East India Company's sailing vessels, as servants and nannies, among many other followers of similar menial occupations, brought over by their British masters on their return to England. But once their utility was over, they were dismissed by their employers and left stranded in a foreign country. Okay. They became the surplus products who were born out of the British capitalists' perpetual search for surplus value or profit. But paradoxically enough, these leftovers found fresh opportunities on this alien soil, thanks again to the same capitalist drive of their British hosts to discover a profitable terrain for reinvestment of their profits in surplus production and absorption. The terrain was London in the 18th to 19th century period, and the means was urbanization, a progress which could mobilize the surplus products, both the indigenous unemployed and the imported Asian and African underclass, among others. Now, urbanization displaced not only the indigenous poor farmers who were thronging in the modern industrial city of London without any employment, who lost their lands. Added to that, people from Africa, from India, they were actually homeless in the great city of the West. Okay, I'm quoting again. Urbanization created highways and streets which opened up spaces for popular entertainments and theater halls. The fate of the Indian immigrants of those days was intimately linked with these avenues where they could eke out a living by using their wits. They took up a variety of occupations in the role of jugglers and street performers come beggars, with some among them often moving to London's respectable playhouses. But whether in the streets or music halls, they had to walk a tight rope, being watched with fascination from one side and suspicion from the other by their English spectators. A peculiar ambivalence fractured the latter's attitudes and behavior towards the Indian immigrants. The image of the dark, inscrutable Oriental that they formed from a distance over generations by reading travelogues that were half real and half fictitious, which even prejudiced a great mind like Shakespeare's, lingered on in their psyche when they met these Indians face to face. This direct contact with them was also contaminated by a whole structure of racist prejudices and fears that was being constructed at that time by the colonizers' superiority complex and the white man's burden to civilize the colonized Indians. Now, here comes the forgotten yet interesting story of Ramosamy, the Indian juggler. The Ramosamy was a street performer, a very poor man who actually lived on showing different tricks in the streets of Madras, now Chennai. But many people who actually were related to East India Company, they actually found in Ramosamy a possibility of earning a lot of money by taking him to show the magical tricks in their own country, because juggling is a native Indian art. It was almost unknown in Europe during the time. Okay, even there is a very important book by Jacob Donowski, and the title of the book is Jugglers, Jaduwalas and Jinns, the Magical History of India. Okay. In that particular book, John Jabrowski has referred to the fame of Ramaswamy in the 19th century England and how he became a star performer over there. But interestingly, Ramaswamy, when he was actually performing on the streets of Madras, he was doing some juggling tricks which were not only peculiar but which were astonishing and amazing at the same time. For example, he was juggling with 4 or 5 balls, 5 copper balls. Now, these are very common juggling tricks. He could swallow a 6 feet sword and could put it out from the mouth without hurting any part of the body. It was something that is not very easy to perform, but it was actually the native Indian juggling trick. And Jahangir, the Mughal emperor, he has also referred to this particular trick of swallowing a sword in his book Jahangir Nama. Now, India was stereotypically known for the land as the land of magic, and Ramaswamy became the symbol of magical India. And many people became interested in Ramaswamy, and they actually took him to their country, where they actually earned a lot of money encashing upon the juggling skills of Ramaswamy. Interestingly, when Ramaswamy died, he died a pauper, and his wife had to give an advertisement in an evening newspaper asking for money to cremate him. Okay. He was a star performer, but he had no money. Why? Because actually his colonizing patrons made a lot of money out of his skills, and he had nothing to live with. Such a talented person. Interestingly, with Ramaswamy, these particular juggling tricks became very rare in his own country, where these tricks were actually born. And many Europeans, they actually learned the same tricks from Ramaswamy and became famous worldwide. So they took our native knowledge and made it their own. Now, if we go through the famous essay by William Hazlitt, that is the Indian Jugglers, we come across the sense of amazement and astonishment when Hazlitt actually came across a performance by a troupe of Indian jugglers in the famous Olympic Theatre of London. Okay. Now, from the contextual details, it becomes clear that Hazlitt also watched a performance by Ramaswamy and his group. Okay. Now, Hazlitt starts his essay by describing his absolute astonishment upon watching Indian jugglers perform in London's Olympic theatre. Hazlitt was known for his wildly exaggerated style. However, his genuine amazement is clear. Coming forward and sitting himself on the ground in his white dress and tightened turban, the chief of the Indian jugglers begins with tossing up two brass balls, which is what any of us could do, and concludes with keeping up four at the same time, which is what none of us could do to save our lives, nor if we were to take our whole lives to do it in. Is it then a trifling power we see at work, or is it not something next to miraculous? Is it the utmost stretch of human ingenuity, which nothing but the bending the faculties of body and mind to it from the tenderest infancy with incessant, ever anxious application up to manhood can accomplish or make even a slight approach to? Okay. Now he writes, Hazlitt writes, man, thou art a wonderful animal, and thy ways past finding out. Thou canst do strange things, but thou turnest them to little account. To conceive of this effort of extraordinary dexterity distracts the imagination and makes admiration breathless. Hazlitt was clearly amazed. He goes on to state next that, I quote, as to the swallowing of the sword, very important line, the police ought to interfere to prevent it. Now, Hazlitt is writing in course of the essay that nothing is so full of amazement, astonishment, as actually the performance, which is on the verge of improbable by the Indian juggler. He even writes that the hearing of speech in parliament, drawled or stammered out by honorable member or the noble lord, the ringing of the changes on their commonplaces, which anyone could repeat after them as well as they, stir me not a jot, shakes not my good opinion of myself, but the seeing the Indian jugglers does, it makes me ashamed of myself. I asked what there is that I can do as well as this. Nothing. So he actually finding himself inferior when he actually sees the performance of Ramaswamy on the stage and the kind of impossible things he is making possible with ease. But whenever the man actually swallows a sword, Hazlitt is reserved in his praise for that. He says that in that case, police should intervene. So why? Because Hazlitt was in praise of the Oriental performing arts. He is of the opinion that we cannot do the same, but at the same time, he is not free from the Orientalist prejudice of considering Indian practices as uncivilized or something full of squalor or full of criminality. And a police case should be filed for swallowing the particular sword, because it is not actually a kind of civilized practice. But in India, that is a performance, that is a part of the performance. Jahangir has written in Jahangir Nama that he had also seen a person swallowing a sword. So Ramaswamy is actually a successor of that kind of jugglers who actually used to swallow sword with ease without hurting any part of the body. But to the British, it is still a kind of savagery. Okay. Now, these are some important issues which actually come to the fore if we try to locate these complexities related to modernization, colonization, imperialism, and the resultant globalization. And if we actually think the Romantic period as the starting point of that particular process. Okay. Now, Romanticism from that point of view cannot be understood properly without reference to modern imperialism and modern capitalism. Perhaps this seems clear enough today. Okay. And modern imperialism and modern capitalism at the same time, they cannot be properly understood without reference to Romanticism. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your valuable share of thoughts. And now I would request our chief guest, Dr. Devdas Roy, to preside over the next 4 sessions. And Dr. Devdas Roy is Associate Professor and Head the Department of English, Sukumar Sengupta Mahavidyalaya. He has done his PhD on John Donne's poetry and sermons from Vidyasagar University under the supervision of Dr. Tirthankar Das Purakayasto, and he has a fairly good number of publications which credits. He is the chief editor of Middle Flight. He has authored 2 books jointly with Dr. Pritha Kundu. The books are Understanding Romantic Poetry, A Critical Reader, and Shakespeare in Focus, in commemoration of the quarter centenary of Shakespeare's death. So I would request sir to preside over the next sessions. And thank you. Over to sir. Devdas Babu.
Thank you, Uttam. And first of all, I would like to extend my cordial thanks to Principal Sir and my esteemed colleague, Mr. Gaur Hari Mandal, the head of the Department of English, for kindly inviting me to chair the session. I feel honored, sir. And I also congratulate Dr. Ujjal Kumar Panda, who has delivered a wonderful and meaningful keynote address, which is just over. I was listening to his talk in fall, beautiful talk, like the perhaps as Hazlitt was in fall of the Ramaswamy the Juggler. So nice talk, whom Ujjal, I lovingly call him Ujjal. And
Thank you.
I welcome the distinguished speakers, and I welcome all who have chosen to share the platform with me. And I congratulate the organizers. Especially a mention should be made of Mr. Uttam Majhi. Actually, Mr. Gaur Hari Mandal has at the very outset said that he was very instrumental, and Ujjal also has said very active and very instrumental in making this seminar take place. So, with these words, I'd like to begin the paper presentation session in right earnest. But before that, let me say something about the word reading and rereading. You know, you have rightly focused on an area which is very, very vibrant and pulsating kind of area in terms of student interest. Gaur Babu was referring, requesting the speakers during his introductory talk to take the student interest into account. So in that sense, romantic literature, rereading romantic literature, British romantic literature is really a vibrant area in that sense, because the students will take in interest in it. And I have noticed that the title of the seminar, Rereading, you have not used the hyphenated rereading. You have used rereading, a solid word, non-hyphenated word. That's good, because that is chosen, that is preferred during modern times, because the hyphenated rereading is suggestive of a gap, something after, is suggestive of a chasm. But when you use the non-hyphenated rereading, it is suggestive of a continuum, of something, of criticism, of readings which is in progress, which is progressive, which is a kind of evolution. So in that sense, it is indeed during when Ujjal, Mr. Ujjal, Dr. Ujjal Panda was talking, it was very clear that romantic readings form a kind of continuum, something progressive. And when you, in the 21st century, you look at the romantic landscape, the critical landscape of British romantic poetry, you find that the interpretations, which have come, the interpretations are ever changing and gradual. When you read now this important book I refer by David Cooper, Digital Library, Digital Literary Cartography, Mapping British Romanticism. When you read this book today, you feel that it belongs to a critical edition, which of romantic literature, which began with liberal humanism, which continued through, you should say, new criticism, which continued through post-structuralism, deconstruction, feminist criticism, and many more. And Dr. Panda was referring to geocriticism, how it is relevant, with special reference to Wordsworth, he was saying how it is very relevant, is geocriticism, how romantic text can be read from geocritical angle, from feminist angle, from eco-critical angle, from cultural materialist angle, so many. So the word rereading is suggestive of that continuum. And the word rereading also comprises that the main component in the word rereading is reading. When you read something, the meaning of the word reading, among others, has two important meanings. First, reading is a kind of aesthetic pleasure. You read and you are well pleased to read it. When you read, your heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. That sort of reading. When you read, you are carried away. When you read, the desire of the moth for the star, of the night for the morrow, the devotion of something afar from the sphere of our sorrow, the lilt of the line, euphoric kind of. So you never be critical. You never think like the liberal humanist Matthew Arnold, that Shelley is an ineffectual angel beating his luminous wings in the void. No, you never be critical. You enjoy the text. When you read, for example, another text, very simple kind of nursery, written in the nursery rhyme and meant for children. Ba, ba, black sheep, have you any wool? Yes, sir, 3 bags full. One for the master, and one for the dame, and one for the little boy who lives down the lane. When you read it, you are guilt-free. You never think that the black sheep is a reference to slaves, and indentured laborers, as Dr. Panda was saying, Indian jugglers, Ramaswamy, and so many contexts. Your pleasurable leave these things outside your purview. You never think of the little boy in the last line, and one for the little boy who lives down the lane. You know, the little boy, the plight of the little boy, the social hierarchy in the changing society, a society, as Dr. Panda was saying, which was fast changing from the agrarian to the industrial. There are a lot. You never think of that. When you read Tintin, to give another example, in hours of weariness, sensation sweet, felt in the blood, felt heart, passing even into our mind with strong story. Never think that are we possible to make any coherent signification of the lines? Are the thoughts communicable? Do we share what the poet is feeling? You know, is it not that the poet is experiencing something from which we are alienated? Is it not a kind of fragmentation and loss of organic unity? You never think of that while giving a kind of naive reading. Huh? And when you read Frankenstein also, you are so carried away by the sensational Gothic element that you forget about the genre mixing, how she affects the mixing of genre, very critical in this narrative, how she reflects upon the question of the nature of good and evil, how she makes Mary Shelley as a woman writer, how she makes the woman's subordinated, silenced voice, audible through a genre which is relatively low in the generic hierarchy. You know, this sort of Gothic story, sensational story, were considered to be quote unquote low literature, especially by William Wordsworth. So how Mary Shelley gives, makes us hear a feminine voice through this. All these things are not. How she intervenes into the politics of society through this narrative. All these things we do not take into account when we give a kind of pleasurable reading, aesthetic reading of text. But that is not to be. It is apparent from the keynote address, because we always try to read. We always try to reread. Actually, reading becomes rereading when it is made contemporary. Reading is made contemporary. Yes, that is very significant. So, Romantic literature, British Romantic literature has been made contemporary through the ages. It is discussed even today, in this age of globalization also. It is very relevant. And then, but unfortunately, when we, but it also happened during our undergraduate days also. When we talk about romanticism to the students, we talk about the stereotype of individualism, of self, etc., etc. You know, I'm not dwelling upon those things. So those stereotypes, proper kind of rereading wants to challenge the foregrounding of the stereotype, and proper kind of rereading wants to pay attention to the possible other readings. I'd like to come to the papers of the three paper presenters. Before that, let me mention one essay by my teacher, rather our teacher, Professor Shankar Prasad Singh. Professor Shankar Prasad Singh, in his essay, Other Echoes Inhabit the Garden, Rereading 19th Century British Romantic Poetry. It's a wonderful essay by Professor Shankar Prasad Singh, published in the journal Middle Flight. In this essay, he has said that the word romantic is used in a variety of cultural contexts, as Dr. Panda was saying, and it means widely different things. And in his paper, Dr. Singho has referred to the post-structuralist study of romantic literature by Tilottama Rajan. That's a very important book. The name of the book is The Supplement of Reading, Figures of Understanding in Romantic Theory and Practice. And Dr. Singho also makes a mention of another important book, David Simpson's Wordsworth and the Figurines of the Real. It is just a famous book. Wordsworth and the Figurines of the Real. And he has also mentioned about another important feminist reading of romantic literature by Anne K. Miller. The name of the book is Romanticism and Feminism, and also Romanticism and Gender. So with these words, with the words of my teacher, Professor Shankar Prasad Singho, that yes, we need to reread, we need to give a kind of make criticism, make reading contemporary. So with these words, I come to the paper presentation session in right earnest, and we have a very talented panel, and we have three speakers during the session, three speakers, and I think okay, the chronology, the order of the papers is being declared a little later. But before that, let me say that how long would you like to continue? Please let me know. It is 20 minutes or 30 minutes?
30 minutes.
Okay. So thank you, Uttam, for letting me know. So each paper presenter is going to have 30 minutes for their presentation, and the forum, I mean the session will be open for questions, comments, observations, etc. At the end of the I mean when all the papers have been presented, not before that. And you may leave the questions in the chat box, but I would appreciate if you interact direct with the paper presenters. So first, first presentation to be made by Mr. Otonu Bera. He is the assistant professor and head Department of English, Shilla Chandrasekhar College. And the title of his paper is Contemporaneity and the Timely Nature of Wordsworth's Poetry. So, Otonu, please make a start.
Thank you, Chair. Devdas Babu. Thank you, Ujjal, for your wholesome keynote address. And before that, I would also like to thank Uttam, who happened to be my student earlier, and then again Professor Gaurhari Mondal, the departmental head, and of course the chief patron, the principal sir, and then my dear students and my fellow speakers here, who happens to be my friends again. So as sir has already mentioned, the title of my paper, the talk, so to say, is Contemporaneity and the quote-unquote timely nature of Wordsworth's poetry. I have taken this phrase from Emma Mason's The Cambridge Introduction to William Wordsworth, Timely Nature, which I will discuss in due course of this talk. First of all, I thank Devdas Babu for explaining the key term, rereading. Yes, it was the intention, and it is not, we are not here to unlearn anything. It is actually a continuum, and in doing so, I will speak on some aspects of Wordsworth's poetics, which are less discussed but crucial to the understanding of his poetry in particular and romantic literature in general, with reference to some lesser known poems. And in doing so, I will be discussing on the contemporaneity of William Wordsworth's poems. So Wordsworth is the worshipper of nature, the nature poet, and the nature priest. Yes, he is all these things and more. His poetry actually is more engaged with, as we have found in the keynote address, the social, political, religious, economic aspects uh, than his reputation as a nature poet. Uh, we may call him a humanist, a radical humanist, so to say, but it would be unfair to label him because if we do a wholesome reading of Wordsworthian poetics, then we will find what figure he was. So it is difficult to label him or to categorize him. He was, on the one hand, strongly opinionated, very vocal about certain social and political aspects. On the other hand, he suffered from a very crucial self-doubt regarding his poetry and his poetic capability. Uh, he is a radical, on the one hand, quite ironically, who sympathized with the Tory politics of England's elites. And again, he was an Anglican churchgoer who, in one of his poems, proclaims to his the great God that I would rather be a pagan. So, along with these contradictory attributes, there is one that there is another one where we see the person and the poet Wordsworth, who is much loved by others, and he has a great respect for the community. But again, there are moments of loneliness and seclusion in him. So, because of all these contradictory traits, it is difficult for us to compartmentalize him theoretically. So, of course, the discussion of Wordsworth's poetry has to start with the discussion on the Enlightenment, 18th century Enlightenment. So, as the keynote speaker has already mentioned, I will not go into detail. So, that Enlightenment means a kind of promotion of rational thinking and logical argument. Okay, so it attempts to understand the workings of life, several aspects of life through reason, through rationality, which baffled Wordsworth because for him, it is impossible to understand what it means to be human until and unless we relate to nature. So, this reciprocity with nature is very crucial for him. So, from this perspective, we can term him as a counter Enlightenment poet. So, a kind of counter Enlightenment spirit was there in his poems, especially. So, for him, life is not a straightforward journey of progress and development, as the Enlightenment and the consequential industrialization and economic growth suggests. But rather, quite contrary to that, living for him was a process of accidents, chance happenings, and arbitrary incidents which cannot be explained so simply with simple logic or rationality. So it is much more than that. So the linear concept of progress brought into effect by the Enlightenment was baffling to Wordsworth. So moving on to the next section, the environment was under considerable threat from Enlightenment ideology. Industrial and economic change was there, and the poison of getting and spending more was affecting the British society. So, as it is evident in one of his poems, "The world is too much with us." I will just read a few lines for the students, especially, so that they can relate. "The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon." And then he continues, it moves us not, great God, that line I mentioned, it moves us not, great God, I would rather be a pagan, suckled in a creed outward. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, having glimpses that would make me less forlorn. So that destitution is very much evident in his poems, which is a resultant of uh, the environmental threat that enlightenment posed. So moving on to the next point of the idea of enclosure, which uh, Professor Ujjal Kumar Panda has discussed in detail, but I will touch upon that idea and try to relate with some of the poems of Wordsworth in particular. So the idea of enclosure and the rhetoric of improvement. So Britain was steadily propelled into an industrialized capitalism. So technological destruction of landscape was there, and the process of enclosure was resulted in uh, homelessness, famine, starvation, poverty, etc. So this, as it is evident in the world is too much with us, the spirit of getting and spending more, as this shift into the culture of greed was set in motion by the newly embraced capitalist mode of production, which was flourished under the rhetoric of improvement. So this improvement, as Ujjal Kumar Panda has already said, that it meant recasting, a sort of recasting. So the concept of picturesque was there, the rusticity of the country life, or the little hamlets were artificially reproduced. Okay, so the elites, the wealthy elites from the city bought those places from the community who actually owned those lands earlier, and then they turned it into a sort of pleasure haven, or a sort of artificially created uh, beautified places, where quite ironically the communities, the people who actually owned those places earlier, were denied access, were not allowed to enter, and they entered quite ironically only when they became the employees or the laborers. Okay, so in a way, those landowners actually, the indigenous landowners actually felt deprived. Actually, they were denied of their own property, and more than that, above all, the customary rights that comes with it for the Aboriginal people, the customary rights of collecting woods, of fishing from the rivers or the jungles or the lakes, for peat gathering, etc. Those customary rights were announced to be were criminalized, and when they were criminalized, so it evidently resulted in uh, it evidently turned those uh, people, the Aboriginal people, into vagabonds, beggars. So that is the critical and the cruel picture that uh, resulted from land enclosure. Okay, so similar kind of thing was happening. If I may draw a connection between the Santhal rebellion. So though it is not completely the same, but same spirit is there. The in during 1832, the East India Company invited the Aboriginal people from the Bengal Presidency, from the jungles of the Bengal Presidency, to reside in what we know today as Rajmahal Hills, all those areas, and they were promised several things, and they were lured by the East India Company. They settled from several parts of Jharkhand, from Midnapur, etc. to those into those places, and then it was quite a shock for them. The East India Companies sent those jamindars to collect the taxes, and bereft of their own land that they actually owned earlier. So they were compelled to take loans in high interest, which they couldn't obviously repay. And again, that trauma continued. They were again uh, turned into homeless vagabonds. So, and in reaction to that, the four Murmu brothers, Sidhu Kanu and Chand Bhairav, started the rebellion. So, which was happening in 1855, so the mid 19th century. And if we try to draw a connection with the more recent activities, so the things that are happening in Jharkhand and many other hilly regions in the name of mining, the Aboriginal people who reside or in the inhabitants of those hilly regions are evacuated, they are evicted, and in order to mine those lands. So the government policy, the corporate capitalist kind of economic side and the government policies, all those factors are still relevant, which was there and which against which Wordsworth was very much vocal in that time. So through this, I am pointing to the contemporaneity of Wordsworth's poetics, what he was saying in his poem, rather implicitly, and sometimes in his letters very vocally or explicitly. So again, the point of improvement, I would like to share a personal experience of mine. I went on a tour with two of my friends here, Somo and Soman, to Rambha Lake most probably, and there was there were some scattered islands, rocky islands actually, little islands, which were the paradise for birds. Birds, hundreds of birds used to lay eggs. It was their breeding grounds. It was paradise. But then someone decided to improve, quote unquote, improve that land by creating a statue of dinosaur there. And when we visited there, rather revisited, we saw nothing there. Only the poor dinosaur was standing with his seemingly terrifying face. No birds were there. So the idea of improving the nature is a fallacy, actually. And Wordsworth was against this. He was staunch believer of the fact that nature can never be improved. But quite ironically, British Empire has been using this strategy of improvement as an excuse for his colonization in home and abroad too. This strategy of enclosure and improvement was happening. So as it impoverished the laborers, driving the wanderers and beggars into the filthy workhouses, where they had to stay in dire conditions, dire sanitation, and terrific uh, health conditions. They were compelled to live in the workhouses. So the beggars were taken into those workhouses at the cost of their dignity. So here, in one of his poems, The Old Cumberland Beggar, Wordsworth or the narrator shows his respect or reverence for even the beggar who was supposed to be forcibly taken to the workhouse. Here he says, as in the eye of nature he has lived, so in the eye of nature let him die. Let him be as he is there. Let not play with his self-dignity by artificially imposing or forcibly imposing our sense of morality upon it. Let him be the way he is. Okay, so in many of his poems, Wordsworth has actually dwelt on these ideas. One such poem is An Evening Walk. In this poem, the poet focuses our attention on the evening, a shadowy interval between day and night, when we are supposed to pay more attention to get a clear view, and so we feel deeply, more intensely what we see in front of our eyes. He describes the mystery of whatever he sees around him, the nature, the horses, the heron, and of course the fair swans. But then there's an odd element, a female vagrant or the beggar, uh, which was not supposed to be there. As it is the night time, he was supposed to be inside his hut or in his or her home, but he has no home. He has nowhere to go back. That is the reality of industrialization, and that is the result of land enclosure. So the poem, which was supposed to be a nature poem or a poem dealing with natural beauty, read from this view or this perspective becomes a testament for the harsh reality of the time of industrialization. So then again, the poems, the Salisbury poems, there too, the two wanderers, uh, when they were wandering over the desolate landscape, they were engaged. Of course, first of all, they were engaged in a sort of spiritual quest, as the symbol of Stonehenge was there. It is evident that it is a sort of spiritual quest, but there is an unmistakable social quest also, because that place, that region was once a place of thriving agricultural center, but now it has turned into an arid land because of the industrialization. So that social and economical angle is also there. One such example is, I don't think I have enough time. I will just touch upon a poem named Stonehenge. And often at night fire mountain to the clouds reveals the desert, and with dismal raid clothes the black bodies of encircling crowds. It is the sacrificial altar fed with sacrificial altar fed with living men. So the mystic side, the spiritual side is obviously there, but along with that, a tinge of irony, a tinge of socio-economic destruction is also there. Okay, now coming back to another vital context, that is the context of the French Revolution. So Wordsworth had always supported the revolution uh, because of his personal experience in Paris, in France in general. He was dismayed as he witnessed the poor rural economy, the poverty in the rural area of France, because which was the result of aristocratic greed. But then, when he returned to Paris in 1792, when actually France was going through the most difficult time, the horror was at its height. He was horrified at the social turmoil and saw the horror which was potentially spreading to Britain also. The city, Paris, which was a place of political hope for Wordsworth, now has turned into a place of a dreaded place, a place of fear, in his own words, a place of fear unfit for the repose of night, Wordsworth says. So confounded by these ghastly visions of despair, at the revolution's decline from a revolution to tyranny in front of his eyes, he saw French Revolution turning from revolution to tyranny. He was disillusioned actually. But he was disillusioned, but he was not absolutely hopeless, unlike others, like Brooke. So he was not hopeless. He found hope, and he believed that humans are always saved from self-interest by the relationship with others. So, with relationship with nature, relationship with other human beings, animate and inanimate objects, other forms of beings, all those were referred to by others. So that message of hope we can again find in another poem of his, of Wordsworth, The Ruined Cottage, where nature elevates the spontaneous blessings of with its spontaneous blessings, it elevates the human condition, human benevolence to those shattered by the social effects of war. So, like the female vagrant whose family was shattered both by war and by land enclosure, in the ruined cottage too, there's a similar image, but there is hope. There is hope in nature's benevolence. There is hope in human relationship and the essential kindness of human being. So Wordsworth never lost hope. He was hopeful actually. Then another offshoot of imperialism or colonialism was black slavery. Wordsworth was vehemently vocal against uh, slavery, black slavery actually. And imperialism sustained, or imperialism has been sustained by black slavery. And Wordsworth protested against slavery. In his letter to Bishop Landolph, he wrote, "Slavery is a bitter poison. Slavery is a bitter and poisonous draught." So he was very much vocal and very much against the slave trade. I'm trying to put it in a nutshell. He again was a champion of the freedom of speech. He urged the East India Company. He urged the throne also for making freedom of speech an indispensable condition of civil rights, both in home and in the colonies. So, from that perspective of human rights, Wordsworth stands tall too. So, finally, another context which is again unmistakable is the element of ecology in Wordsworth. We may term Wordsworthian poetics to be eco-poetics. The element of ecological angle is unmistakable. Wordsworth poetry presents a lyric apprehension of the life of things, human, non-human, animate and inanimate, provoking a fellow feeling for all modes of living being. That we, so as I've already mentioned, that we may term his poetics as eco-poetics. His poetry enables all readers to enjoy or endure life by teaching them to look at and dwelling in the natural world. And in doing so, readers are freed to develop an ecological bend of mind, ecological attitude of mind that has potential to engender an effective set of environmental policies. Now, from the green critics' perspective, centralizing geography rather than history, green critics focus our attention on Wordsworth's eco-poetics. So there is a constant analogy of walking, restless walking, anxious walking, and sometimes contemplative walking in Wordsworth's poems. If we study, if we read the records by Dorothy, and we go through the poems also, there is the constant metaphor of walking. And this, from Toby Venice's perspective, Wordsworth, it shows a kind of pedestrian's perspective of nature to us, which is at the same time political, aesthetic, and ecological too. Nicola Rowe too also contains a critical focus on Wordsworth's politics of nature, opens discussion of urgent modern environmental issues, but returns to the idea of Wordsworth as a radical human. So, whose works is consistently suggestive of his kindly emphasis on human community and benevolence and love. So, I will conclude with saying that we see in Wordsworth a revisionary approach, rather revisionary approach to humanism. And therein lies the contemporaneity and the relevance of Wordsworth even today. So this sense of contemporaneity is perhaps what Emma Mason refers to when she says in her book, The Cambridge Introduction to William Wordsworth, when she points out to the phrase timely nature of Wordsworth's poetry. Very few before him spoke of the ordinary and the common. So modern critics might ignore Wordsworth's service for the poor in this time, but when we read his poems closely, the elements, the humanitarian elements, the elements of the social harshness, social reality are very much prevalent, and they are unmistakable. So studied in this way, Wordsworth stops being only a nature poet or a word or a worshipper of nature simply, or a mere nature priest. Rather, he emerges as more relevant, more contemporary, both in political, social, and aesthetic way. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Otonu, I really enjoyed your paper. You know, I know you are a singer, and the song is marked by spontaneity. When papers come from the heart, you know, it becomes really spontaneous. Your presentation was nice and very spontaneous. I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed reading Wordsworth's poetry. You have emphasized the contemporaneity poetry. You know how he helps us to how his poetry helps us to endure life, to enjoy life. So many aspects you have touched. It is not paraphrasable, your paper. So many aspects you have touched upon. But still, you have said about the radical. Someone to say that Wordsworth is radical. But you have emphasized that he cannot be categorized. Right, you are. When you say about radical, I am reminded of a line by Robert Browning. Is the poem "The Lost Leader"? You know that line. Only for a handful of silver he left us, and how Robert Browning denounced Wordsworth for switching over to the conservative bloc like that. So debate is there, and you have mentioned that there is self-doubt in Wordsworth. Self-doubt. That's why he cannot be categorized. He is neither a Tory nor a Whig, you have said. And great God, I would rather be a pagan. You have quoted from that poem. And moments of celebration and loneliness. You have also touched upon the point of counter-enlightenment poet. He is a counter-enlightenment poet, you have said. And living is a chance occurrence, right? Living is not something, what should I say? It happens. It's not something fixed. It's not something definite. and it's not something, it really should be arbitrary, not well planned. That we want to say perhaps. And the linear concept of progress, it challenges. Linear concept of progress, that getting and spending, you have echoed what Ujjal in his keynote address said, getting and spending, that sort of mentality is decried, denounced by Wordsworth, out on creed, and you have referred to, very importantly, very vital, enclosure. Very important issue mentioned in the keynote address also, how it led to homelessness, how it led to poverty, how country people and the farmers were wrested of their freedom, isn't it? And their independence, come to resolution and independence. And you have referred to the old Cumberland beggar. You have referred to that poem, and I am reminded of Tintern Abbey, the refugees, the homeless youths, the pasture lands green to the very door. So many references there, and I take particular interest in what you have said about the East India Company. Right, East India Company at that time, when Shelley was also, he also wrote a poem, Lines to an Indian Air, one poem he wrote. So in that poem also, how was India like in that time? In that poem, Shelley mentions of a champak flower, which is an Indian flower. How was India like then? You have mentioned about the condition of the zamindars, who, like the farmers, like some people who relied on agriculture, they also lost land in India, and how their condition was. And that is something, the reference to East India Company and reference to Wordsworth. In Wordsworth poetry, you have said that there is an implicit protest. You have said sometimes explicit protests are there, but his poetry is embedded in implicit protest against imperial hegemony.
May I add something, sir?
Yes, definitely.
About the previous point, actually, I was about to tell that the zamindars were instrumental. The zamindars were instruments in the hands of the East India Company.
Right.
Instruments for collecting the tax from the.
I see that you want to say, land. And how the farmers were
yes, robbed of their land. It was they were tricked. They were allured first, and then they were tricked by the East India Company. And about the second point, sir, about Wordsworth being implicit, in some aspect he was very vocal, but then he was persuaded by his brother and Dorothy not to be so much vocal, because the fear of persecution was there. And then again, there were several phases in his life when he was very much economically bankrupt. He had to support his wife, and so he had to take a government job, which was very much unethical, quote unquote, for him, relating to the revenue department. So both Shelley and Byron criticized him because of his dichotomy, so to say. But we have to study it from Wordsworth's point of view, the way he was struggling economically, and the way he was trying to support his family, which actually he resigned from that post after he was announced as the poet laureate 7 or 8 years before his death, and then he resigned from that post. So the question is, the question shouldn't be there.
Right. So thank you for your observation. It makes the whole thing living. And I would like to come to Shomodip. And before that, one point very interesting: the idea of improving nature. You have said that idea is it's a contradiction in terms you have said, and you have related your personal experience with your friends. That's very interesting. Let it be as it is. That's it. So many points. It's not possible to cover all the points you have said, but it's a nice paper, and I hope it will elicit very good response. Now, next paper presenter, yes, is already there. Mr. Sommodi Chakraborty, faculty member, Department of English, Raja N.M. Khan Women's College, and doctoral research scholar, Department of English, Bankura University. Sommodi, your title of your paper is Adult Child Interplay and William Blake's Poetry. Now, the space is yours. Please continue.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. I'd like to take this opportunity to convey my heartfelt gratitude to the organizers who have thought of me to deliver a lecture in this webinar. And paying tribute to the patron, the person in chair, my respected teacher, and all the participants and my co-presenters, I would like to straight away move to reading my paper, which, as Sir quite rightly categorically has pointed out, that it is entitled as Adult Child Interplay and William Blake's Poetry. Now, I would like to make a presentation here, and from another window, I'm just about to present some slides. So let me just have 1 minute or so. Can you see the slide?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Now, I'm not making it a full screen view. It is for my benefit in order to make a swift change of the slides. I'm not making a full screen view of the presentation. Now, so adult child interplay. Interplay is a very interesting word, and that keeps on visiting between, as Sir has rightly mentioned, reading and rereading. So an interplay keeps on making its point between reading and rereading. So that's also very interesting to mark. Everywhere there is interplay, and here I'm to focus on the adult-child interplay. In select poems of William Blake, since the honorable head of the department has already mentioned that this webinar is primarily and precisely meant for the students of the institute. So I also would try my best to stick to somewhere that would be meaningful to the students of the institute. I mean, the undergrad and postgrad students of the institute. So let me present the first slide. That is the interplay in William Blake. Before going into the details of describing what is there in the slide and what I have thought of saying, I would like to mention that William Blake is being parenthetically put within a group that is precursors of Romanticism, which he actually is not. I mean, to call William Blake a precursor of Romanticism merely is a kind of attempt of undermining the great amount of potency, romantic and creative imagination that we have in his works. There is a great critic and author, C.H. Herford, who is well known for his book, The Age of Wordsworth. He says that Blake, Wordsworth, and Coleridge, they must be put within one bracket. So that I also do think, I do subscribe Professor Herford's idea. So William Blake is as good a romantic as Wordsworth and Coleridge. He is not a precursor of romanticism. He is a romantic, or the romantic as good as Wordsworth and Coleridge. Now, romanticism, or romantic period, tethered. I really think here that you have known the meaning of the word tether. It's a very key word to understand different ideas related to romanticism. So, romanticism, or romantic period, kept on tethering between different contradictory and contrasting poles. And one, of course, is the pole of subjectivity and the pole of objectivity. Now, I have planned to mention some subjective interplays that were there in Blake, and then I have planned to move on to mentioning, pointing out the objective renditions of the subjective interplay that we have in William Blake. So, the subjective interplays at first, the interplay in Blake. Now, he was born in 1757 at Broad Street. Now, these are the biographic details for the students, actually, to make a context for them for this talk. He left school when he was 10 years old. He took admission in Royal Academy, England in 1779. This is very key, the thing in the life of William Blake. And there he got engaged in contradicting Sir Joshua Reynolds, the then president of the Academy. It was the point when Blake's creative faculty started tethering between reason and imagination. So it has been there. The tethering, the oscillation between reason and imagination, it was there. It, had been there even before the Romantic era. And it is actually the oscillation between reason and imagination that invited Romanticism as a philosophical quest, primarily, and then the aesthetic quest later on. And it helped him immensely in affiliating himself to the philosophical spirit of the age that sought to make a balance between the Cartesian thinking, quote unquote, as Descartes, I mean, Cartesian is an epithet of René Descartes, and the Rousseauian feeling. Now, let me explain it. Descartes, a lot earlier, it was back in the year, if I'm not that wrong, 1667, I suppose. Back in the year 1667, that 1637, sorry, 1637, that he wrote a book. René Descartes, the great continental philosopher, he wrote a book, a Discourse on Bezard, where he mentioned that cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. There is also another element that I doubt. I think, therefore I am. So Descartes, the Cartesian philosophy, to a great extent, gave ample importance to the faculty of thinking. And it had greatly been challenged later on by the great Enlightenment philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, Rousseau, the Rousseauian idea is that I feel before I think. And he published a book, actually, a compilation of his thoughts and ideas that later on got published in the year 1782. And the name of the book is, the compiled book is Confessions. It's one of the greatest publications before the advent of the great romantics like Black verses and Coleridge. Now, Rousseau claimed that I feel before I think. Now, it was a kind of battling, it was a kind of warring against the presupposition of thinking as established by the Cartesian philosophy. And so there was an interplay. There was a kind of oscillation between reason and imagination. There was an oscillation, a tethering between what I should say, between logic and instinct, better to call, between head, between the faculties governed by head and the faculties steered by our heart. Though it is a very proverbial question, let me tell you that it's a very proverbial question, it's a proverbial issue, that whether what the romantics think of heart actually stays within the biological organ heart or not. Because whatever the romantics meant as heart actually stays within our cerebrum. হৃদয় দিয়ে ভাবা তো সম্ভব নয়, মাথা দিয়েই আমরা ভাবি, সুতরাং একখণ্ড হৃদয় আমাদের মাথাতেও রয়েছে, সেটাও ঠিক। So this disjunction between head and heart can also be contradicted in this way. I'm not going into detail to all these things. So there was these sorts of interplay already before the advent of William Blake in the realm of painting, in the realm of writing. And don't get baffled and intrigued by the title of the slide in abbreviation CONT, font. For the students, undergrad and postgrad students, I'm saying so. This is merely an abbreviation that means continuity. Okay, so this is a kind of continuity of the previous slide. So it's a continuum, as mentioned by my respected teacher. So that's right. And the interplay in Blake. So Blake's creative faculty was found to get grounded within some sort of interplays, oscillations. And here we have the interplay in Blake, the person, the subjective interplay in Blake, the person, the poet, the painter, and the printer. What had greatly been undermined is the creative potency and creative output. William Blake, the printer, he was a prolific, great, innovative printer because he invented of his own a newer reverse etching printing method. Blake, the poet, Blake, the painter, and Blake, the printer, you know, these three Blakes, I would say, all the time, used to make an interplay in Blake, the creative person. And we have a newer method that had been championed by William Blake. And Blake's method is illuminated printing of poetry through illustration or intaglio. The method is called intaglio method. Now, what is this intaglio method? I have put the three key words in the sentence in uppercase, with uppercase, that printing, which means Blake the printer, poetry, Blake the poet, and illustration that comes up with Blake the illustrator or painter. On the left-hand side of the slide, deliberately, I have put a plate, because whenever comes the idea of printing, comes the idea of plate. Before printing, you have to prepare a plate, and this is how Blake used to prepare his plates. So we have interplay. In Blake the creative person, we have the interplay of Blake the poet, Blake the painter, and Blake the printer. Now, as I have already said, that I'm gradually going to take my talk to the objective rendition of the subjective interplay. And the first step is that the publication with which we all started to, or the romantic audience, readers, they started to come across the name of William Blake, the publication of Songs of Innocence, primarily in the year 1789 that you all perhaps know, and later on in the year 1796. 94, Songs of Experience, but together, the collection together comes out as Songs of Innocence and of Experience, showing the two contrary states of the human soul. Mind you, this is not my spelling mistake. Shew, S-H-E-W. It had been used by William Blake, and it was the custom of writing the word in this way. But the pronunciation, let me tell you, remains the same, and it is showing, not shewing. It is showing the two contrary states of human soul. Now you can see that the plate quite categorically shows that there is the interplay of Blake the painter, Blake the printer, and Blake the poet above all. Now, bringing in contrary states of human soul and human life, as he envisioned human life and human soul as having two almost hemispheres like the word. Two hemispheres, like the hemisphere of innocence and hemisphere of experience, and coupling these two hemispheres, so we have William Blake's world, as our world is formed, shaped by two hemispheres. So William Blake's world is also formed by these two hemispheres, let me tell you, the hemisphere of innocence and the hemisphere of experience. Now, bringing in the contrary states of human soul and human life together, while you are bringing in contraries, innocence and experience in literary terms, in literary meaning, they do not come at loggerhead. But as per Blake's interpretation, definitely these are the two words antithetical to each other. Innocence is an antithesis to experience, and experience an antithesis to the former, I mean innocence. Now, while you are bringing these two binaries, contraries, opposites, as per Blake, innocence and experience. I mean, Blake all the time had meant that whenever it is innocence, there must be an absence of experience. And when there is the gradual rise of experience, there must be a gradual warding off of innocence. So in that way, they have a very interesting binary relationship. And when you are bringing in contraries, binaries, you're actually bringing in interplays. And Blake's poetry, to a great extent, is found to subscribe various kinds of interplays. Right now, we are going to focus on that. Childhood. Let me, as I have already made my point that my talk is going to focus on the adult-child interplay. Let me at first tell you that the construct childhood is actually a kind of adult concept and an adult construct. So within the literary representation of childhood, we have the interplay of adult machinery and consciousness. So childhood in literature basically is a produced concept, and adults to a great extent produce it, generate it. Now, any attempt of understanding childhood is an adult mechanism. Why I'm saying so, let me explain. Whenever you go on studying childhood, you are not thinking yourself a child. And that is a reason why you are going to study it. And whenever you are calling something childish, definitely you are not thinking yourself as being a child. It is only the adults who can say that this or this is childish, since the adult really thinks himself or herself as being an adult, not a part of childhood. So childhood, by and large, is an adult constructionist idea. Adult constructionist idea. It is the adult construct. And there are several metaphors, images, codes, coding and encoding, that play significant roles, respective roles in the making and shaping of the idea of childhood. Now, the sociologists and the psychoanalysts opine that childhood is a retreat from the labyrinthine complexities of adulthood. So whenever you get frustrated in the labyrinthine complexities, complex engagements of adulthood, adult writers create children characters, and they go on representing childhood in the realm of literature that the sociologists and the psychoanalysts think. Now, interpreting childhood from the parlance of the Lacanian psychoanalysis, Jacques Lacan, the great psychoanalyst, postmodernist psychoanalyst that he is, the Lacanian psychoanalysis, critics like Karen Coates, Mavis Raymer argue that the representation of children and childhood highlights the lack in adulthood. The lack in adulthood, and refers to a fulfilling agency to the adults. So lack in adulthood. Whenever the adult writers become conscious of the fact that he or she has become adult, on that very moment, a lack starts coming in, creeping in his mind, that he can't be a child, he can't revisit his or her childhood anymore. And this lack actually generates a desire, a counter desire in the mind of the adult writer to read something about child on child. So they are saying, Karen Coates and Mavis Raymer, they are saying that it is a kind of fulfilling agency. An adult writer writing about children or childhood, it gets a kind of pleasure of fulfillment, that now the lack is over and now he is fulfilled because he has everything. He has adulthood that right now he is engaging, that right now he is enjoying, and he thinks that he has, quote unquote, created childhood in the realm of his literature. So it is the fulfilling pleasure that an adult writer starts enjoying. In Discipline and Punish, this is a very key book, seminal work, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison, that was published in the year 1995. Groundbreaking book, really, by Michel Foucault. And the book has argued extensively that childhood is an idealistic fantasy of the adults. is an idealistic fantasy of the adults, which means the adult writer perhaps had not done some of the things in his own childhood what he is making his children characters to do in the realm of his texts. So it is the idealistic fantasy. The childhood might be like this, might be like that. Childhood might be a phase of pure innocence. So in this book, Foucault is making his point that childhood is actually a kind of idealistic fantasy. And we keep on thinking about childhood when we become adults. Foucault theorizes that the adults tend to exercise disciplinary power. In this book, he also mentions that there is also another power like sovereign power. Also, there is another book, Power Knowledge, that you have to read to understand the genomics and the dynamics of power relationship between adult and child, between society and individual. But I'm not going into all these things, but here he mentions that disciplinary power that an adult exercises and children are the means of exercising it, which means it is the disciplinary control that an adult exercises over children in every means. And he actually, and if we interpret it, it definitely could be that the writers of literature who write about childhood or children, they actually exercise a disciplinary power by making whatever, by making the children a puppet simply, whose hand must be tied to the hand of the writers. So he actually exercises, the writer, the adult one, the adult writer exercises the disciplinary control over the adult, over the children characters in the text. And even the psychoanalyst like Philip Erres goes on to say that the idea of childhood didn't exist before the medieval era, the medieval period. In the realm of literature, children in childhood are brought forth as a trope or device to escape censoring of the adult reactions, anxieties, concerns, statements, and messages. We have sensory. We have some, elderly figures of culture. In every civilization, in every race, in every culture, we have some elderly persons of culture who think that they are the forefathers of culture. Culture is jathamoshai. They think that culture must be that, culture must be, that, culture must be this. We must speak in this way. We must see things in this way. The society must look in this way. And so they keep on exercising everything in the society by virtue of censoring. By virtue of censoring. We have, while there are film industry, there comes the issue of censor board. So there are some constant censoring. So childhood, these are used as device and tropes to keep the texts away from the clutches of any kind of censoring. Okay. And critics like Karen Sanchez-Epler gives an account of how literature goes on thriving and representing children and childhood with various adult biases. As I have already said, that it is a production, adult production. Childhood and children is an adult production. So there are several adult biases, and it is always the adult gaze that we can't simply ignore while we have to represent children and childhood in literature. Now, let me tell you that I'm not simply telling all these things regarding children's literature. I'm telling all these things in relation to the representation of childhood and children in the realm of literature. It might be adult, it might be children. Since William Blake's poetry necessarily is not a part of children's writing, necessarily, you may interpret, but necessarily it doesn't fall to the category of being children's literature. I mean, necessarily Blake's writings are not children's literature. There are some elements, but necessarily these are not children's literature. So I'm not saying also all these points in relation to children's literature. These are general points. While whenever we see representation of children, even in adult literature, we see these things as the theorists down there, these scholars, they keep on saying. Now, this is the case study. Now I'm going to making case studies one after another. And I'm beginning with reading the lamp. This is a reading or rereading without any kind of hyphen, as my teacher, Professor Roy, has rightly mentioned. The lamp. And I have planned to go by the case studies by mentioning at first the exterior and the interior then. The exterior is a space where we have frequent visits of the childhood and children. But the interior, if we probe into the interior of the text, we have found that the text actually asserts, promulgates several adult issues, several grave crises. The exterior, let me at first tell you the exterior. Now, if you look at, reading of William Blake's poetry is almost incomplete simply without having an idea of the illustration that he had made. That is the reason why I have shown this the illustration on the left-hand side of the slide. The exterior, if you go by the poem, The Lamb, the exterior shows the speaker a naked newborn baby. The speaker here is a naked newborn baby who is an emblem of divine innocence. The nudity of the child, the picture quite blatantly shows that the child is naked. And the nudity or the nakedity of the child simply is the marker of innocence. The sylvan and the pastoral setting complements the childlike innocence. The language and the rhyme-like shaping of the poem complements the childlike innocence that the exterior of the poem brings forth. Now, what about the interior? If we probe into the text, The Lamb, we will find, little lamb who made thee is a question that raised to illuminate God's design of Genesis. Now, this idea of Genesis is very, very Christian, rooted to Christianity, and is a very complex kind of idea. A child, a naked newborn baby, can't simply have any idea of the Genesis. You must be aware of the fact that lamb to a great extent alludes to or borrows material from the book of Jeremiah and Charles Wesley's hymn, Gentle Jesus, Meek and Mild. This is one of the very important Christian doctrinal work available at that point of time. The portraiture of the image of Jesus as meek and mild, throughout the poem is an attempt to establish Christianity. Now, this is something very, very serious and added. A naked newborn baby simply can't, make point in this regard. Gentle Jesus, meek and mild, or Jesus, meek and mild. Throughout the poem, there is an attempt of portraying Jesus as a figure who is meek and mild, is always a redeemer. Christ, the redeemer. God the Son the Redeemer, the ultimate Redeemer. And this is the New Testament. This is the New Testament rendition of God. The Old Testament idea of Jehovah was an angry God. And Christianity, in order to undergo a religious evolution, it thought of bringing in a new Christian idea of God, a redeeming capacity of God. প্রভু ঈশ্বর ক্ষমাবান, সবসময় তিনি রেগে যান তা, তিনি ক্ষমাবান, তিনি ক্ষমাশীল, আমাদের প্রতি যত্নশীল, caring, just like a caring father. God is caring to us. So the deliberate portraiture of the image of Jesus as meek and mild throughout the poem is an attempt to establish Christianity, the religion, Christianity, as a tolerant, monotheistic religion. Mind it, at that point of time, I mean, for a long time, in Europe, there was the predominance of, earlier, there was the predominance of a monotheistic religion, Abrahamic religion, Judaism, and Christianity contradicted the principles set by the Jews, set by Judaism, and Christianity bore an idea that as if Christianity is a kind of, like Judaism, it is another militant, monotheistic, intolerant religion. Now, there was an attempt by the Christians, even in the realm of literature, pious Christians, even in the realm of literature, to change this image of Christianity as a whole, to make Christianity a liberal, tolerant, monotheistic religion. So, gentle Jesus, meek and mild, is an attempt of making a new Christian idea of God, a new Christianity, which is liberal in approach, inclusive in treatment. The illustration refers to the caring, protecting, nurturing, and sheltering capacity of nature that the poet seeks to assert at the backdrop of growing industrialization of the time. Let me revisit the previous slide. The tiny twigs of the trees from both the sides of the picture definitely gives us a dome-like shape. It is the sheltering capacity of nature that painter William Blake tried to arrive at. So this is the caring and protecting, nurturing, sheltering capacity of nature that he seeks to assert at the backdrop of growing industrialization that started to plunder the purity and tranquility that is there in nature. And the poem is designed as a monologue. The child is questioning and he himself is answering back. The poem is designed as a monologue. The monologic structure complements the ethos of monotheism in the poem. Monotheism in the poem. So all these issues, these are very, very adult issues, but it seems to be a poem which is all about childhood and children. Now, the issue of language, I'd like to mention the issue of language that is used here by the poet is very interesting. The phenomenologist like Martin Heidegger says that language is means of acquiring, becoming a being. Being and becoming. Being is not important. Becoming a being is important. So a human being is not important. Being a human being is the most important thing right now. This being a human being means becoming a human being. That Heidegger pointed out in his books, like Being and Time. And Heidegger's idea is that language is very interestingly, a means of acquiring becoming. Structural linguists, they say that language is a process of signification. The psychoanalysts like Lacan and Kristeva, they say that language is the signification through the psychosocial and psychosexual assertion. So language is not that much very simple thing. Acquiring language is acquiring identity, acquiring signification. So this is very, very important. And developmental theorists like Erik Erikson, he says that a child learns linguistic codes through the process of introjection, which is very critical a term, which is all about selection and rejection. And so the language is very, very complex thing. Now, here the little boy, the child, not only using language, is molding language as per the rhyme-like structure. He's rhyming the language, which means he's molding language. This molding of language can't be done by a child. So this is simply the gaze of an adult. The adult writer, William Blake, is always there. We can't simply ignore the presence, the omnipresence of the adult writer, William Blake. Whenever the child speaks, it's actually the adult writer who speaks. So always there is the interplay of adulthood and childhood.
Please bear with me for saying wrap up.
Well, definitely, sir.
Okay.
Definitely. The Little Black Boy. Another poem, The Little Black Boy. If we go by the exterior, the poem would seem like that there's a little black boy. Little is definitely a marker of innocence. So just 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes.
All right.
The poem we have in the poem that my soul is white. That my soul is white. This white definitely refers to the Christian soul, which is divine, which is filled in divine bliss. The little black boy represents divine benevolence and divine providence. And the little black boy speaks of Christian absolutism at the exterior. But if we probe into the interior, we'll find that the little black boy itself is a kind of oxymoron. Why? Because little comes up with the metaphor of something innocent. And innocence that we all know comes up with the metaphor of something white, celestial. So little and black is a kind of oxymoronic juxtaposition that I think. Little black. But what this black actually means? What this black actually means? It means the complexion of the boy. The boy is a black boy, which means there is a very serious and grave issue of racism. Racism. And a mere boy, an all innocent boy, can't simply address the issue of racism, which means adult writer is always there at the back of the children characters. The Chimney Sweeper poems, we have the exterior is a naked and white, again represent these two words represent innocence. Little Tom's emotional journey, which is all about the Chimney Sweeper poem that is included in the innocence part, is actually the little Tom's emotional journey. And there are the other boys like Dick, Joe, Ned, and Jack. They have provided him with emotional support. So this, as per the exterior, the poem seems like that, but the interior reads like, my father sold me. There's a line. So there is a very serious and grave adult issue, like poverty and child. I mean, the child is sold, which means child is represented here as a commodity. Commodity, child as commodity, which is very, very serious kind of issue. Your chimneys I sweep, and in shoot I sleep, which means the wretched condition of childhood. The word play of a matured adult poet. You know, there is a very interesting word play, like whipping and sweeping. Whipping and sweeping. Definitely, it is a very interesting word play on the part of the adult writer, the adult poet. Simply, a boy, an all innocent boy, can't play with words in this way. We have the Chimneys poem, the experience, the exterior again seems to be saying all about the wretched condition of the child, but the interior, and the child speaks himself of the wretched condition of children throughout the country, but the interior says that the social exploitation of the child in distress. The poem shows the child as being a bread earner. He works, and he works to earn his bread, which is very interesting. A child as a bread earner. Usually, we see an adult to be a bread earner, but this poem establishes a child as a bread earner. So again, the interplay of adult and child. So I'm not going into details of all these things. The thing that I'd like to mention that children and childhood frequently visit William Blake's poetry as the signifiers of innocence, the tropes and the metaphors of innocence, the vehicles to drive home Blake's serious, grave concerns, his idea of life, and most importantly, childhood and children. These things, these ideas are brought as an antithesis to experience. Now, this is my end statement that the Romantics were categorically, this is another thing that I mentioned, the last thing perhaps, the Romantics were categorically aware of the huge body of literature banned during the preceding Restoration and the Neoclassical periods. We all know that a huge amount of literature and literary works had been banned during that point in time. And the Romantics keep on becoming, kept on, or keep on, if in present tense, we can say, keep on becoming critical of the existing social order, governmental policies, and yet finding ways to escape serious charges that could lead them and their poetry, literary works, towards banning. So they rarely employed satires, as it had been done by the Restoration writers and Neoclassical writers. Romantics were not that much hackneyed in using satires, and that is a reason they didn't use satires, as they didn't like it as well, technically. And they were critical of the use of rampant use of satires by the Neoclassic and the Restoration writers. And so, as they didn't use satires, they needed some kind of veil. They needed some kind of veil to wrap their anti-establishment statements and messages and reactions up. So, if Wordsworth did it by bringing in the pantheistic treatment of nature, Coleridge did it by affiliating his poetry to an intoxicating supernaturalism. Shelley, Keats, and Byron did it by taking their poetry to the abode of ethereality. Let me tell you, Blake did the same by bringing in children and childhood in the realm of literature as the signifiers of innocence to a great extent. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Shomoti, for your cerebral kind of presentation. I would like to call it cerebral. You have brought in so many issues. Laka is there, phenomenology is there. Your theoretical grounding is really interesting, and it might be that students may find it tough to follow the theoretical grounding, but your the way you have related with the poems is very nice, and that portion they have enjoyed, I believe. And so you have mentioned so many things. Next paper presenter is waiting. It's not possible to summarize everything. So many is there. So briefly, you have talked about Descartes and Rousseau, and also this subjective interplay in your theoretical portion, and that interesting observation in Bengali you made at Khonda Hridoy amader mathatei royeche. That I find very interesting observation. And the illustration, of course, I agree with you. Blake's illustrations, are very important in understanding his oeuvre, his poems. It's a kind of objective rendition of subjective interplay you have said, and bringing in the contrary states of mind. Right, you are. That is something because in Blake, without contraries there is no progression. The famous saying of Blake, So it's rightly pointed out, and how there are two hemispheres. You have said hemisphere of innocence and hemisphere of experience. Right, the process.
That constitutes Blake's world.
Yes. In Blake, you find that. And of course, about childhood, that is a very, very interesting kind of observation, that childhood is a kind of adult construct, you have said, and you have fairly dwelled upon this issue. It's a kind of refuge from the complexities of adulthood, you have said. And you have also referred to the Lacanian ideas, Lacan who has argued that the representation of childhood highlights the lack, quote unquote, lack in adulthood. And so glorification, reference to childhood, is a kind of fulfilling agency. According to Lacan, you have said, and you have also made a mention of discipline and punishment by Foucault, where he says that childhood is an idealistic fantasy of the adult, and so many issues. And after that, with this background, theoretical grounding in mind, you have tried to read 3 poems, and not tried to successfully read 3 poems. Lamb's, it's a kind of case study. The first one is, what is the first one? Little lamb who has made the lamb. Yes, the first one, the lamb, and a little black boy, and the second one was?
The little black boy is the second one, and
second one, the Chimney Sweeper.
Chimney Sweeper poems of the Innocence and the Experience, both the Chimney Sweeper.
Nice. I enjoyed your paper, and I congratulate you for such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Now, next, I come to the next paper presenter, who has been waiting for quite a long time, Mr. Somen Jana, Assistant Professor of English, Sabanag Mahavidyalaya, and the title of his presentation is Romantic Narrative, a Subjective Note on Confusion. So please present your paper, Somen.
Okay, I hope I am audible, sir.
Yes, perfectly audible, and your smiling face is so encouraging.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. At the beginning, I must extend my sincere thanks to the organizers of the webinar and the authority. Thank you so much for inviting me and giving me this platform for sharing my views. And most importantly, thank you for inviting, even after knowing fully well that I do not have any expertise in this field. Like you all, part of me has been shaped by the romantic elements we have been fed since our childhood. Hence, as one of this extended romantic contingent, I have attempted this rereading. Most of you have already come across the title I have chosen for this talk, Romantic Narratives, a Subjective Note on Confusion. You would first look into this lecture title and try to carry forward our engagements along those lines. I mean, from whatever this title tries to implicate. But let me assure you, however, that after a heavy dose of romanticism for almost 3 hours now, I just don't want to test your romantic patience anymore. I will try to be very brave, very matter of fact in a way. আমি মোটামুটি ভাবে চেষ্টা করব যতটা সম্ভব ওভারভিউটা খুব সহজে দেওয়া যায়, since it is addressed mostly to the UG and PG students. As you have already known, romantics, like all the words associated with them, romanticism, romantic poetry, I mean everything. The romantics, they have enough of contradictions, which is of course not a despicable thing, but which makes our understanding of the field a bit difficult. Difficult in the sense that it resists our endeavor to straitjacket it. I mean, we cannot just homogenize it in a single epithet, just romantic or anything. If we go back to the title again, you will see that I have made it very opaque. Nothing definite or particular has been said. I would definitely love to connect it to the opacity or the mysterious air the romantics were so fond of. But the fact is, this shows my limited and confused vision or understanding of the field. Those words like visions, opacity, they are very much romantic in flavor, as we all know. So is the word subjective, which I have used in the title, and the subjectivity that we will find in the whole field. These terms not only cover up my limitation, they are intended to give you a sense of the romantic, quote unquote, the romantic. And again, the stress is on the word the romantic upfront. If you have noticed, I have used the title article the, and it is and this singularity of the associated literature, it has been debated a lot, beginning since the early and mid 20th century. So we have literatures instead of literature, and ঠিক যেভাবে আমি বলতে চাইছি সেটা হচ্ছে যে রোমান্টিসিজম বলতে একটা সিঙ্গুলার আইডিয়া যেটা আমরা বুঝতাম, যেটা আমরা জানি বা জেনেছি, এবং আমরা পরেও জানতে পেরেছি যে সেটা ঠিক সেই রকম নয়, তার ভেতরে অনেক বিভিন্ন ধারা রয়েছে, ডিফারেন্ট স্ট্রেন্ডস আর দেয়ার, স্ট্রেন্ডস অফ ডিফারেন্ট টাইপস অফ রোমান্টিসিজম ইজ দেয়ার। সো এই যে জায়গাটাতে আমরা আসবো। And I have this privilege because the previous speakers have already mentioned, they have already stressed this plurality of the field, this diversity of the field. And what I intend to do in this brief, I will try to make it brief. I intend to put to order this diversity, this plurality. It may seem contradictory, but I hope you are not taken aback by the word like order, which is avowedly a neoclassical and Augustan attribute, and which is everything the Romantics supposedly stand against. But just let me assure you again that our order will be very cacophonous symmetry, or a bit orderly disorder, almost in line with Godwin's political ideas about anarchy, where he said that anarchy, I mean, in his conception, it is an orderly anarchy. So our reading or rereading here will paradoxically highlight each and every distinctions and differences, only to find out the whole field, only to understand the whole field more completely. So you must be wondering why I am taking so much time to arrive at the content of my talk, but you know, this is not my fault. The Romantics themselves, they took so much time before they arrived, almost revolutionarily, at their proper subject. You have already known that how difficult it is to periodize it historically. The critics have often marked a time frame which is as long as a century, from 1750 to 1850. I mean, this is that long. There are, of course, historical association. I will talk about that later. So the first confusion we have about the Romantics, about the Romantic literature, is the confusion regarding the historical time frame. ওই যে সময় হিসাবে, বছরের হিসাবে ঠিক কোন সময়টাতে ওরা বিলং করছে, আমরা একটা রাফলি একটা এরিয়া জানি যে এত থেকে এত পর্যন্ত, কিন্তু এক্স্যাক্টলি পিন পয়েন্ট করাটা আমাদের পক্ষে খুবই কষ্টকর, খুবই প্রবলেমেটিক. We have certain historical events like the American War of Independence, the French Revolution, or the literary events like the publication of lyrical ballads, যেগুলোকে আমরা associate করি romantic literature beginning এর সাথে. But the second confusion, which is more prominent, this is regarding the words romantic and romanticism. It has already been spoken about, so I would not go into detail, but just let me stress here that the semantic associations these words have acquired over all the years, these associations have further complicated the field. The term romantic was not at all in fashion until the first few decades of the 19th century. More importantly, as we have come to know, in the early and mid 20th century, the critics used such terms to designate a set of aesthetic practice and cultural movement or a bunch of writers writing in a specific moment of history. মানে 20 শতকের প্রথম এবং মাঝের দশকে এসে একদল সমালোচক রোমান্টিক শব্দটাকে ইউজ করছেন আর আগে আসা কিছু রাইটারের লেখাকে বর্ণনা করার জন্য. Now here this is very problematic because what they are doing, they are bunching together or bracketing a heterogeneous set of values and practices, and this bunching together actually complicates our understanding of it. Thus, while reading romantic writings, we have to be aware of this diversity that is often ignored or overlooked. We would remember that the terms like romantic designates both varied aesthetic practices and writers writing in different style. I will try to elaborate this point I make here. Related to this confusion is the confusion that arose out of this homogenization of this diverse field. The sweeping generalization I have referred to in the previous point, the diversity I have talked about is so real that it will confuse us further. মানে একে তো রোমান্টিক শব্দটা নিয়ে গন্ডগোল, তার উপরে যেটা হচ্ছে রোমান্টিক লেখাপত্রের কাজে এত ধরনের বিভিন্নতা রয়েছে, তাতে কিন্তু বুঝতে আমাদের আরো ঝামেলা হয়. So this diversity is actually very much this diversity actually confuses us more. Here let us look into a few literary works to see how diverse this field is, and for that I'll just repeat, I mean in a brief way, what has been said by Atanuda, Ujjal and Shomodeep, that romantic literature is of course revolutionary in spirit, no doubt about that. The romantic literature announced its revolutionary credentials by claiming to be everything the Augustan literature was not, besides emerging as a product of the continental revolution. So we know that this was how much this was influenced by the continental political and cultural atmosphere. So this has been talked about, and I will not go into that. Here, just as a note, since this whole lecture is going to be a note, as a note, I would like to add that এই যে আমরা বলি যে বিপ্লবের একটা বিশাল প্রভাব ছিল এবং এই সমস্ত রাইটাররা তারা চেষ্টা করছিলেন যে একটা সবার মধ্যে একটা রেজিস্ট্যান্স থেকে শুরু করে সব কিছু ছড়িয়ে দিতে, বাট দ্য জেনারেল মুড অফ দ্য পাবলিকের যদি জেনারেল মুড আমরা দেখি সেই সময় ইংল্যান্ডে মূলত it was so disillusioned after what actually happened after the French Revolution. ওই যে রেইন অফ টেরর থেকে যা যা হয়েছিল তাতে মোটামুটি ভাবে একটা বেশ রেবেলিয়াস অ্যাটিটিউড থেকে একটা কনফর্মিস্ট অ্যাটিটিউডে শিফট করে গেছে। তাই রাইটাররা খুব লোনলি এবং আইসোলেটেড ফিল করতেন এবং তাদের যে ইডিওলজিটা ওটা অনেকটাই কিন্তু রাইটিং এর মধ্যেই সীমাবদ্ধ ছিল। অ্যাকসেপ্টেন্স কিন্তু আমার মনে হয় সেই অর্থে আসেনি। In a way, I would not go into that. It positioned this romantic literature, no doubt, positioned itself in contrast to the Augustan aspirations of an impersonal, urban, carefully calibrated, and classically formed mode of writing. We all know what is open talk of romantic literature, that this is the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions, but we forget that these words were actually qualified by certain other words that would actually undermine the spontaneity, that very spontaneity. I will come back to that later. And then in that and during that period when it emerged in a revolutionary mode, poetry actually took the lead. It tried to make a difference. It challenged not only the Augustan mode of poetry, but also it took on the popularity of the Augustan novel. This Augustan novel so far has fed the public appetite for insight into the private lives of the public. For example, say if Pope had to write or articulate his personal opinion on a subject, it often takes the guise of public conscience. And there was not an iota of deep personal feelings or his sorrows or his apprehensions, but romantic poetry, it opened itself up. It emphasized subjectivity, it emphasized strong individualism. Now, this subjectivity and individualism, as we know, that it is one of the markers of romantic literature. Therefore, the attempt to read them in a unilateral manner would be a disservice to the complexities of the field. The individualism was not new to us. It was fostered by the philosophical and religious practices during the Renaissance. I mean, we know that besides several other factors, Reformation gave rise to this sentiment by prioritizing personal adherence to God's words to public displays of worship. The later day development of capitalist and materialist culture, coupled with disintegration of the rural organic society, both endangered and augmented this sense of individuality. We can understand this from few examples, like a romantic figure, be it the writer or the hero, as the poets have shown us, is pictured as a solitary entity, isolated and distant. The archetypal image of the romantic poet as alone, at odds with the society, find enough expressions in Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, and Byron. Think of Wordsworth wandering lonely as cloud in the Lake Districts, Coleridge lost in his drug-induced world, Byron dying in Greece away from home. This solitude is romanticized. Love and nature are also romanticized. These are both enabling, at the same time problematic if we look at them carefully. You remember, Bacon made us believe that whosoever delights in solitude is either a wild beast or a god. And probably the romantics have taken that godly association a bit seriously, as their writings express an egotistical leanings, which is again challenged by two of the most prominent writers of the time, Jane Austen and Mary Shelley. I will just come back to it shortly. I will mostly focus on Austen and Shelley. Just let me put it here. Though romantic literature, poetry in particular, signifies generally an investment in imagination, nature as subject for poetry, and in the role of poet as a prophet and visionary, there were two main differences. They were too individualistic. For example, Blake had a personal system of symbolism. This individualism is romantic, no doubt, but his poems, from songs of innocence and experience, these are written in a prosaic mode, and which is very much different from the style of writings of Wordsworth and Keats. Again, though Wordsworth and Coleridge promised of writing in a vernacular, in a vernacular language, their language was very different from the melodious colloquialism of Burns, Robert Burns. All of you know that. Thus, we can see that there are much difference in the field of uh, poetry, romantic poetry. I mean, talk of kids. Kids এর কবিতা যদি আমরা দেখি তাহলে দেখব যে he is more devoted to art and the beauty in art. He is less concerned about the world that is around him. I mean, of course, there can be. I mean, we can read their poems in a Marxist or in a different way, but Keats is more devoted to his own world of art and beauty. And Shelley is more hopeful of a rebellion, of a revolution, where Byron is quite is not that much optimistic about a change, though he actually was more flamboyant and impetuous in that way. So like poetry, another field exercised individualism in a very diverse registers. This is the field of romantic novel. This actually I would like to talk about. আমি romantic narratives নিয়ে বলেছিলাম। এখানে narratives বলতে আমি actually যেটা করেছিলাম সেটা হচ্ছে যে আমি শুধুমাত্র fiction বা non fiction কে রাখিনি। আমি I tried to incorporate all the narratives that are actually floated around the debates about romanticism or romantic, the word. সুতরাং the next field of study for us is the romantic novel. Now, this designation of romantic novel, romantic novel, it's so misleading because we have Gothic novel, we have domestic novel, we have historical novels. I mean, they're so very different in flavor. Now, if repose is one of the markers of romanticism, Gothic novel actually fits well within the romantic formula, as it reacts to the purity and the refinement of the Augustan literature. It is basically Gothic, it is basically a dark repository for the excesses which the Augustan literature cannot accommodate. They were so refined. I mean, the Augustans were mysterious settings, exotic locations, crumbling buildings covered in fog, lost pathways. All these things actually populate this Gothic genre of fiction. The revival of medievalism that we often associate romanticism with, this revival of medievalism may be because of this. But in spite of being revolutionary in its taste and treatment, this genre of literature was highly censored by the guardians of the romantic high idealism. I mean, poets like Wordsworth, because the horrors and the mixing of genres was against the egotistical refinement of those poets like Wordsworth and others. I mean, you have Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in your syllabus, and Frankenstein actually, Shelley's novel actually undermines and questions this high-handed idealism of romantic refinement. The grotesque features of the monster, the way the weird process of animating it. I mean, all of these may raise a few eyebrows of the propagator of the liberty and individualism. However, this text by Shelley is quite subversive in more than one sense. Actually, it is not imbued with the proposed universal faith in progress, nor is there any unqualified faith in reason. This text is a profound pessimistic response to the modern world. I mean, that actually came with the advent of industrialization. অনেকে এটা নিয়ে বলেছেন, সুতরাং আমি আর বলছি না। It demonstrates an anxiety about what? About the ability of human beings to control the natural forces that were unleashing in the machine age. আমরা যেটা দেখেছিলাম সেটা হচ্ছে যে ফ্র্যাঙ্কেনস্টাইন যে মনস্টারটা ক্রিয়েট করেছিল কিভাবে অ্যাকচুয়ালি তার এগেনস্ট গেল সবকিছুই, ও যে ইন্টেনশন নিয়ে করেছিল তার রেজাল্ট যা হলো, এই দুটোর মধ্যে যে বিশাল গ্যাপ, এই যে গ্যাপটা কিন্তু যেটা আমাদের সামনে তুলে ধরছে সেটা হচ্ছে একটা এংজাইটি at the ability of human beings to control the natural forces, and it thus actually provides a necessary corrective to the romantic vision of the world. And what sort of this vision, I mean, how the vision was? This romantic vision actually held human beings at the egotistical center. So it, in a way, undermines the egotistical ambience of the romantic writers and their writings. But we cannot deny that Frankenstein is not romantic, because it has so many features of romanticism that we already have come to associate it with the literature called romantic literature. While Mary Shelley used Gothic elements to reiterate her positions, another popular name, Jane Austen. Jane Austen, you have heard of that name, you have read about her novels. She actually made fun of the Gothic in one of her novels, that is Northern Jarabe. আমরা কিন্তু দেখেছি যে নর্দার্ন জেরাবেতে কিন্তু এই যে সেন্সেশনালিজম বা এই যে গথিক ইউজ করাটাকে, গথিক এলিমেন্ট গুলোকে কিন্তু ওখানে উনি প্রচন্ড রকম ভাবে মেক ফান করেছেন আর কি, ওগুলোকে নিয়ে কিন্তু হাসাহাসি করেছেন। বাট however, while the poets were going gaga over emotions, sentiments, spontaneity, and intuitiveness, Austen seems to put a break. Her novels are novels of education, a sustained, they all speak of a sustained process of realization, which is not what spontaneity stands for, of course. For example, Pride and Prejudice. In Pride and Prejudice, we see how Darcy and Elizabeth arrive at their final reunion through a sustained process of mutual understanding. ওই ফার্স্ট ইমপ্রেশন, ভুল বোঝাবুঝি, তারপর সেখান থেকে নিজেদের মতো করে একটা ওয়ে আউট খুঁজে নেওয়া, হ্যাঁ, যেটা কিনা অনেকটাই প্র্যাকটিক্যাল এবং প্র্যাগমেটিক। সমস্ত কিছু দেখতে গেলে আমরা যেটা দেখতে পাচ্ছি সেটা হচ্ছে যে অস্টেন কিন্তু রোমান্টিক যে স্পন্টেনিটির ব্যাপারটা আমরা শুনেছিলাম সেইটার দিকে যাচ্ছেন না। আসলে এই যে স্পন্টেনিটি, এইটাকে নিয়ে আমাদের কিছু মিসকনসেপশন আছে। আমরা বলেই ফেলি হয়তো যে জাস্ট একটা স্পন্টেনিয়াস ওভারফ্লো, বাট এইখানে ওয়ার্ডসওয়ার্থ যখন বলেছিলেন তখন বলেছিলেন যে রিকালেক্টেড ইন ট্রাঙ্কুইলিটি, যেটাকে কিনা একটা ফোর্সড প্রসেস, বাট এমন ফোর্সড প্রসেস যেটা অলমোস্ট ন্যাচারাল মনে হবে। সো দেয়ার ইজ দিস ফোর্সড আর্টিকুলেশন, অ্যান্ড এইখানে কিন্তু আমরা দেখতে পাচ্ছি যে জেন অস্টেন যেটা করছেন সেটা হচ্ছে একদিকে কিন্তু উনি আন্ডারমাইন করছেন স্পন্টেনিটিকে, যেটা জেনারেলি আমরা অ্যাসোসিয়েট করি রোমান্টিক লিটারেচারের সাথে, আবার অন্যদিকে উনি কিন্তু ওই আইডিয়াটাকে কিন্তু এক্সটেন্ড করছেন যে it is a sustained process, sustained recollection, sustained understanding. Okay, so it is more like the Augustine principles of rationality is being applied in the personal life. Here she may be viewed as foregrounding of a continuum, not a break. And here I will just mention as a passing remarks that the works of Austen is against the infantilization of human sentiment. আমি আশা করছি এই ইনফ্যান্ট শব্দটা শুনে সৌমদীপ প্রচন্ড রকম এক্সাইটেড হয়ে উঠবে। I will not go into that. সৌমদীপ অনেকটাই বলেছে এই ব্যাপারে, but Austen actually went against this infantilization of human sentiment, and Mary Shelley also went against this mindless reverence of towards enlightenment logic of progress. I hope that that we have tried to understand this field in difference, and viewing them in difference. We can see that there are so much differences in the field of romantic literature itself. There are differences in the field of romantic essay that I will not go. I will not discuss now, because we have been, talking about romantic literature for almost 4.5 hours now. 3.5 hours now. So that I will try to make this point finally, that we can see differences in the field of romantic essays, which actually problematize the essentialist views of romantic literature. And while reading romantic writings, we have to be very careful, very aware of these explicit. These are not implicit distinctions. These are all explicit distinctions that are there. And I hope that I have been able to get across some sense to you. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you so much for listening to whatever I had to say. Thank you.
As the last speaker, because what you have done is a kind of wonderful synthesis of the previous paper. That is wonderful. And during your talk, you have referred to Soumyadeep, to Ujjal, and to Otanu, everyone. So really, if Otanu represents heart and Soumyadeep represents brain, you are a synthesis of the two. That's why I say. So it is a fitting end, and really very good paper. And your hilarious comment at the very outset that you don't want to try our romantic patience, that I find very interesting comment. And you have said so many things, so many interesting things, especially about Frankenstein. I will come to that, because it will be an injustice not to mention the points you have raised about Frankenstein. And right, you are, it's not a singular idea. And so many strands and strains go into its making, and it has been said, and not a symphony, but a cacophony, right? I mean, when we utter the word romantic, we imagine symphony, or we can catch echoes of symphony, but you catch echoes of cacophony. And rightly, Professor Shankar Singh has said, there are so many echoes in the garden. You remember the title of the paper I mentioned. So very nice, you have said, and recollect it in tranquility. It is then the next, when you say that spontaneous overflow powerful feelings, then it is undercut by the next expression, recollect it in tranquility. Go different ways. That's right. You are correct in saying that. And what to say about Frankenstein is really very interesting. It's a subversive text, and he does not approve. She does not approve of the universal faith in progress, and the faith in reason. The unqualified faith in reason is not accepted by Mary Shelley. Very interesting. And you have already told about the anxiety about the ability of human beings to control natural forces. So yes, there is an attempt to control nature, and it entails an anxiety that is there in the novel. You are correct, and a necessary corrective to romantic vision of the world. I admit that. I fully agree with what you have said about Frankenstein, also about Pride and Prejudice, about continuum, and you have said that when we emphatically say that romanticism is a reaction against the Augustan, against Dryden, Pope, the Age of Sensibility, you have tried to say in your own way that Austen in this novel, a lover of rationality, a denouncer of love at first sight, first impression, etc., he represents a kind of continuum, a kind of continuity with the Augustans. you wanted to make that point, perhaps. So
Yes.
thank you. You want to say something, Shomen?
No, sir. Okay.
All right. So with this, I think all the papers were really very living, interesting, so many points raised, and I hope that the organizers would appreciate now, and the session is open for questions, observations, and I believe that the papers should elicit good response. But it's late, already we have 4:30, that's right. Still, I expect that some questions to be there. I invite questions and comments and observations. Put it straight. Or the speakers, would you please search the box if there is any question for you which may be answered by you. If there is any, please. So we are waiting for questions and comments.
হ্যাঁ, প্রশ্ন আছে, খুব ভালো লাগবে। হ্যাঁ, মানে কিছু প্রশ্ন থাকা উচিত।
Right.
I don't see any.
I think food crossing.
Professor Mondol, you are there, and your observation, if any, you feel like saying something. Professor Gaudhari Mondol. So, Uttam, you are not audible.
Ujjal ki রয়েছে?
Ujjal.
Yes, sir. স্টুডেন্টদের তরফ থেকে একটা কোশ্চেন ছিল। কোশ্চেনটা হচ্ছে যে আমরা রোমান্টিক লিটারেচার এবং মডার্ন লিটারেচার দুটোকে যদি আমরা অ্যামালগেমেট করার চেষ্টা করছি, অ্যাসোসিয়েট করার চেষ্টা করছি, এবং যখন রোমান্টিক এরা যখন লিখতেন, were they conscious about what they are writing? আমরা এভাবে যে ইন্টারপ্রেট করব বা তাকে রিরিডিং করা হবে এভাবে, were they conscious about the fact?
Fine. Any of the paper presenters, would you like to comment? That's a very nice question.
আমি জাস্ট অল্প করে বলবো, তারপরে সৌমদীপ বলবে বোধ হয়। হ্যাঁ, অতনুদাও বলবে, দেখছি। প্রথমত যেটা হচ্ছে ব্যাপার যেটা হচ্ছে, ওনারা যে সময় লিখছেন সেই সময় কিন্তু ওনারা মানে সেই অর্থে বুঝছেন না যে ওনারা রোমান্টিক লিটারেচার লিখছেন, কোড আনকোড রোমান্টিক লিটারেচার। ওনারা একটা ডিফারেন্ট লিটারেচার লেখার চেষ্টা করছেন, যেটা কিনা অন্য ধরনের কথা বলবে, একটা রেভলিউশনের কথা বলবে সেই অর্থে। বেসিক্যালি বরং 20 শতকের মাঝামাঝি দিকে এসে আমরা দেখতে পাচ্ছি যে ওনাদেরকে রোমান্টিক বলে আখ্যা দেওয়া হচ্ছে। তো ব্যাপারটা এরকম দাঁড়াচ্ছে যে যখন উনি লিখছেন বা ওনারা লিখছেন, তখন ওনাদের মেন টার্গেট কিন্তু ছিল একটা নতুন ধরনের ফর্ম, একটা নতুন ধরনের সাবজেক্ট, মানে সবকিছু যাতে একটু নতুন হয়। এবার কতটা হতে পেরেছিলেন এবং কতটা হননি সেটা তো আমরা বুঝতে পারলাম যে না, ওনারা পুরোপুরি নতুন হতে পারেননি, কারণ সম্ভব নয়। দেয়ার উইল বি ওভারল্যাপিংস, অফকোর্স দেয়ার উইল বি ওভারল্যাপিংস, এবং আমাদেরকে লক্ষ্য রাখতে হবে ওভারল্যাপিং এর জায়গাটা। এবং আমি আশা করছি এই ব্যাপারে আরো সৌম্যদীপ বা বাকিরা বলবে।
উইলিয়াম ব্লেকসের যে পোয়েট্রি আমরা পড়েছি, সে ল্যাম্প হোক, টাইগার হোক, বা লন্ডন, চিমনি সুইপার্স পোয়েম, সিক রোজ, whatever we have read actually, they are very much valid in this era. Okay, তখন যা পড়েছি তার সঙ্গে এই যে ইউনিভার্সালিটি যে টাচটা রয়েছে, সেটা that is a matter of wonder how William Blake portrayed this era in that romantic era.
Okay, thank you. And so I will come to you, Soumodip and Otonu. But before that, our esteemed colleague, Professor Mamata Ansari has raised her hand. Professor Ansari, would you feel like saying anything? Please, have your say. Then I will come to Shomodip and Autono. Mamata ma'am. Hello, you are not audible, Mamata ma'am. Are you there? You have raised a hand. Okay. Perhaps there is a technical issue. Shomodip, please continue.
Let Autono at first share his.
Okay, okay, that's all right.
I'm there.
That's nice of Somo. Actually, there's no attempt at amalgamating the romantic or the modern together. First thing first. Second point is every age in comparison to its previous age is modern. So modernity is a respective and rather relative term. Second point.
Exactly.
Thirdly, যেটা একদম টু দ্য পয়েন্ট উত্তমের কথাকে উত্তর দেবে মানে মানে উত্তর দেবে বলতে আমি ট্রাই করবো যে অ্যানালাইজ করতে, সেটা হচ্ছে ইউনিভার্সালিটিকে ডেলিভারেটলি ইনকর্পোরেট করা যায় না। মানে দে ক্যানট এপ্রিহ্যান্ড দ্য মেটাফিজিক্সটা যখন লিখছেন তখন 250 বছর পরে তাদেরকে অ্যাপ্রিসিয়েট করা হবে, এটা কখনোই নয়। রোমান্টিক্সটা মডার্নে এসে প্রাসঙ্গিক হবেন 21st সেঞ্চুরি, এটা কখনোই নয়। এটা কখনো অ্যাপ্রিহেন্ড করা যায় না এবং ডেলিভারেটলি ইনকর্পোরেটও করা যায় না। When you are addressing something which is relevant now and with the passage of time those issues remain contemporary, then they become relevant. They remain relevant, they become contemporary. That is the that's how we should interpret these texts. When we are saying that the modernist elements are there or the humanitarian elements are there, those were very much relevant in those eras and those issues are still there, so they are becoming they are still relevant and still our contemporary. That's
Thank you. And Shomodip.
Okay, thank you, sir. Actually, it seems to be one question, yet it actually is a series of questions.
Yes,
actually, the first issue is that you have raised that a chance of amalgamation of the creative and the critical. That how we are interpreting it. Is it the fact that those poets and writers were at that point of time aware of all these things? Definitely no. Creative writing is a different thing. Criticism is a different ball game. So creative and critical, the amalgamation is really hard. Everybody cannot be T.S. Eliot, who is as creative as he is critical. And T.S. Eliot wrote down a text called, the next question is like, what is a classic? Which is a classic creative text, mind it. I'm very interestingly trying to putting this phrase that it's a very interesting creative text of criticism. It is as creative as it is critical. And in that text, T.S. Eliot categorically mentions that there are 2 points, primary. One is the universality that you have mentioned. Another is comprehensivity. These are the 2 primary points that T.S. Eliot mentions in what is a classic. So, whether a literary text could be able to stand by the test of the time can only be answered in days to come. The right sort of example that have been given by Otnuda, and whenever sir, our dear sir is there, I'm quite afraid of saying anything about metaphysicals, but the metaphysicals are perhaps the best examples. That the metaphysicals, they were really very, very popular during their point of time. I'm not coming to the point whether they were famous or infamous, but being infamous is also being popular. So they were by and large very, very popular to their contemporaries. But in between, for say 200 years, we didn't have anything that much, any criticism that much. As the critics, they thought that the metaphysicals are not that much worthy of criticism. And later on, the 20th century revived the critical parlance regarding the metaphysicals. And the same happened even with the Romantics. Let me tell you, Romantic period is also associated with a very interesting catchphrase, that is romantic revival, which means Romantic period itself is a kind of revisit, of Romanticism. And Romanticism already visited the realm of English literaria earlier during the Renaissance. So in itself, Romantic period is a kind of romantic revival. So, time will tell everything. Whether Srijato will be included later on after 50 years in the syllabus of Vidyasagar University or Vancouver University, whatever VU it might be, is a different thing. So we can't say that Srijato is a classic. Let him be a classic. That we may pray, and that's all. Here I rest my argument, sir.
Exactly. Very well argued. Very well.
It's a classic answer.
আমি জাস্ট একটা ছোট্ট জিনিস বলবো, বা যদিও যদি পারমিশন পাই অফকোর্স, সেটা হচ্ছে যে আমাদের যদি আমরা হিউম্যান নেচার বা হিউম্যান সোসাইটি এসব দেখি, আমাদের একটা আর্কিটাইপাল সিস্টেম লাগে। মানে এই যে ইউনিভার্সালিটি যে ব্যাপারটা, ওটা বেসিক্যালি আর্কিটাইপ বেসড। হ্যাঁ, অনেক সময় হয় ওটা আর্কিটাইপাল ইমোশনস, এক্সপেরিয়েন্সেস, কিছু কিছু জায়গাতে কন্ডিশন অনেক সময় সেম হয়ে যায়, যখন আমার এখানকার জায়গার সাথে অন্য জায়গার মিল হয়ে গেল, বা এত বছর আগেকার কোনো জিনিস মিল হয়ে গেল। মানে যেটা বললো আর কি,
you are right to mention that is the reason why we are right now finding Dalit having a kind of synonymity between the Dalit literary studies and Australian Aboriginal writing.
তো এই যে আর্কিটাইপাল কিছু ব্যাপারগুলো এগুলো থাকে, তাতে আমি মডার্ন এজেও দেখতে পারি যে আমার অনেক কিছু মিলে যাচ্ছে। যেমন হচ্ছে ম্যাসিনেজ, এই ম্যাসিনেজটা রোমান্টিকের ওই সময় শুরু। এবার এখন আমরা যে এখানে পৌঁছেছি, এটা তো আরো আলট্রা ম্যাসিনেজ, মানে এখান থেকে বেরোবার কোনো উপায় নেই আমাদের, অথচ মাঝে অনেকটাই গ্যাপ। তো এই যে ব্যাপারগুলো আর্কিটাইপাল কিছু জিনিস থেকেই যায়। হ্যাঁ, যেভাবে রিভাইভালের কথা বলা হলো, এগুলো কিন্তু আর্কিটাইপাল থেকে আসছে। সেখানে আর্কিটাইপ ব্যাপারটাকে আমাদের অল্প হলেও মাথায় রাখতে হবে যে কোনো লিটারেচার পড়ার সময়, অন্তত আমি এটা মনে করি। পার্সোনাল মতামত অবশ্যই।
Thank you. Uttam, the issue raised by the students, I think, have been well synthesized. And any other issue to be raised, or any other question, any of the observation? And Mamata Ansari ma'am, she raised her hand, but okay, got the link perhaps.
Perhaps she is mistakenly raising hands, sir.
Oh, I see. That may be. Professor Gaurav Mondal, Gaurababu, would you feel like saying anything, any observation, add anything to what they have said?
It's been long but pleasing on to hear from you, sir. Really.
Thank you.
But it's time to wrap up and declare the end of webinar.
Okay.
And it will end with the vote of thanks.
Okay.
On behalf of department, I request. Sorry, sir. Will you speak something?
No.
On behalf of department, I request Professor Mamata Ansari to give vote of thanks. Madam Mamata Ansari, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Proceed.
Thank you, sir, for giving me this opportunity. Good evening, everybody. We have reached the end of today's program. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Dr. Ujjal Kumar Panda. Thank you, sir, for your valuable thoughts and beautiful speech on how Romanticism cannot be understood without reference to modern imperialism. Next, I would like to thank Professor Dr. Devdas Roy. Thank you, sir, for explaining the term rereading. We are greatly benefited from your speech and discussion. Thank you so much. Then I would like to thank our eminent speaker, Professor Mr. Otonu Bera. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Sommodit Chakraborty, sir, for such an enlightening and insightful speech on adult-child interplay and William Blake's poetry. We are greatly benefited from your talk on the concept of childhood. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Somen Jana, for such an wonderful lecture. We all enjoy listening all of you. Then I would like to thank our Honorable Principal Sir, Dr. Tapan Kumar Datta, for his constant motivation and guidance. Thank you, sir, for being with us as a backbone. Thank you, our organizing committee. So thanks to each and every member. We are thankful to Professor Uttam Kumar Maji for his advice and guidance in arranging this webinar. We are grateful and thankful to our technical assistant, Professor Mr. Otonu Samanta. Without his constant assistance, this webinar would not have been possible. Finally, I would like to give a special thanks to all the participants in this program. Thank you all for being here with us. Thank you all.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
Mohsen Sari ma'am. So very cordial kind of vote of thanks, and the pleasure is mine and pleasure is ours. On behalf of Otanu, Shambhodip, and Shomen, I say that we are really pleased and elated, honored to share the platform with you, and we are so glad to hear your voice finally.
Thank you, sir. We hope all enjoy this program. Okay. Thank you again. Okay.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
We are
So
also
leaving the
hoping for
platform,
futures.
Dr. Mondon, glad to make your acquaintance, and bye.
Thank
Okay.
We are also hoping for meeting again and organizing a webinar like this in future, sir. We
That
really
would be
enjoyed
my
this, sir.
that would be my pleasure. And you have with you a man like Uttam. He's so active, and you have appreciated rightly. Very active and very instrumental.
Sir, a special thanks to Atanuda, who has been my guide and philosopher as well as Dada. Okay. And
Okay.
for organizing this program, he has helped me a lot. Okay. So,
Always,
thank you.
this is the nature of Otonu. He always helps.
I can, may I request Atanuda to conclude the program with a song?
That's a very appropriate kind of ending that would be.
I think that would be against the spirit of this seminar.
Atanuda has a great romantic voice.
Is there? They are waiting for that. So
প্রস্তুতি না করলে আমি
briefly one or two lines.
যে কোনো একজন রোমান্টিকের মতো করে গাও না, যে কোনো একজন রোমান্টিকের মতো করে।
চিরসখা হে ছেড়ো না মোরে, ছেড়ো না সংসার গহনে নির্ভয় নির্ভর নির্জন সজনে সঙ্গে রহ চিরসখা হে ছেড়ো না মোরে, মোরে ছেড়ো না। Thank you.
Thank you. You know, it is
Sadhu,
as
sadhu.
lofty as the sleeps in Pinton Abbey.
খুব সুন্দর স্যার, গলা এবং ভয়েস এবং সুর, ভয়েস এবং সুর দুটোই খুব সুন্দর।
খুব খুব ভালো গান করে গৌরবাবু। অতনু ভীষণ ভালো, ও অনেক জায়গায় ইউটিউবেও গান টান আছে এবং ও একটা সময় প্রফেশনালি গানও করতো। আপনি জানেন কিনা জানি না, হয়তো জানেন, কিন্তু ও মানে ভীষণ ভালো ও স্টুডেন্টরা জানেন।
I'm always at a loss when requested suddenly or asked to do so. Sorry, not requested.
Okay, sir.
Bye.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Let's call it a day.
Let us end here.
উত্তম সম্বন্ধে একটা কথা শুধু বলতে চাই, মানে স্টুডেন্ট লাইফ থেকেও ভীষণ ভাবে মানে প্রোঅ্যাক্টিভ যাকে বলে, এবং এখনো সেই নেচারটাও বজায় আছে। ভীষণ জলি, ভীষণ এনার্জেটিক এবং প্রোঅ্যাক্টিভ, কনস্ট্রাকটিভ কাজ খুব ভালো করে, লিডিং কোয়ালিটি খুব ভালো। আমি ওকে অল দ্য বেস্ট বলছি ফিউচারের জন্য।
ঠিক, আমিও অল দ্য বেস্ট। এবং গৌরবাবুর হাতে যে এই ডিপার্টমেন্ট, এটা এত সুন্দর অ্যাক্টিভ একটা টিম আছে না, খুব ভালো লাগছে দেখে।
অবশ্যই
একদম ইয়াং এন্ড ইনএক্সপেরিয়েন্স
সব
স্যারেরা আছেন আমার, এনারা না থাকলে সম্ভবই হতো না।
আচ্ছা,
এই যে আপনাদের সাথে কন্ট্যাক্ট করা, এবার আমার এত নেটওয়ার্ক উইক, তো স্যার মানে সেটা বলেই হলো আর কি। উত্তম স্যার বা আমার আরো ডিপার্টমেন্টে যারা আছেন, আমাদের জন্য এটা সম্ভব।
ঠিক আছে, আলাপ হলো, যোগাযোগ থাকবে এরপরে।
হ্যাঁ স্যার, অবশ্যই অবশ্যই।
ঠিক আছে, ওকে, বাই।
থ্যাংক ইউ স্যার,
Goodbye all.
Okay.